Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the strange corners of the world wait patiently for someone to sit down and pay them proper attention. Tonight, we are heading somewhere that looks, from a distance, almost theatrical. Like a stage set built by someone who wanted to suggest danger without quite explaining it. A range of mountains that rises out of the Arizona desert with a kind of blunt, jagged confidence, as if it has always known exactly what it is and has never felt the need to explain itself to anyone. The Superstition Mountains sit roughly 40 miles east of Phoenix, Arizona. If you have ever driven east on the US 60 out of the city, you have probably seen them already, even if you did not know their name. They appear on the horizon as a dark, broken wall of rock, rising sharply from the flat desert floor, their ridgelines ragged and uneven, their faces cut by shadow in ways that change completely depending on the time of day. In the early morning they look almost blue. By midday they burn a pale reddish brown. At dusk, when the light drops low and the shadows fill the canyons, they look like something older than the landscape around them, which, in a geological sense, they actually are. The range reaches its highest point at Superstition Peak, which stands at about 5,057 feet above sea level. That is not an enormous elevation by Western mountain standards, but the Superstitions are not a gentle climb. They are not a place where the terrain gradually invites you upward. The ridges are jagged volcanic tuff, fractured and steep. The lower slopes are covered in saguaro cactus, those tall branching columns that look like they belong on a postcard but will punish you immediately if you fall into one. The canyon walls are sudden and vertical in places. There are stretches of this range where the landscape shifts from open desert to enclosed stone corridor within a few hundred feet of walking, and the sky above you narrows to a pale strip between walls that lean inward. The Superstitions are part of the Tonto National Forest, which covers nearly 3 million acres of central Arizona. That forest context is important because it means the range is technically a managed public land, with trails, trailheads, signage, and ranger oversight. It is not wilderness in the administrative sense. People hike here every single day. Families come out on weekends. The parking lots at the Peralta trailhead fill up on cool mornings in winter. And yet, for all of that ordinary recreational activity, the mountains carry something that most managed recreation areas do not. A specific, persistent quality of strangeness. A reputation that has been building for well over a century and has not faded, not even slightly. The name itself is worth pausing on. The Superstition Mountains were named by Anglo settlers in the mid-1800s, and the name was not chosen casually or playfully. Early settlers noticed that the Apache people, who knew this landscape intimately, treated the range with a particular kind of caution. They warned newcomers away from it. They described it as a place with its own rules, its own power, its own consequences for those who entered without understanding what they were entering. The settlers, not fully understanding the cultural and spiritual framework behind those warnings, interpreted the Apache caution as superstition in the dismissive sense, as if the people who had lived alongside these mountains for generations were simply afraid of something that did not exist. They named the range accordingly, with what they probably thought was a mild irony, and the name stuck. What has also stuck, with considerably more weight, is the pattern of disappearances. People have been going missing in the Superstition Mountains for well over 100 years, not in the way that people occasionally get lost in any large wilderness area, though that happens too. The Superstitions have accumulated a specific documented record of hikers, prospectors and treasure hunters who went in and did not come out. Some were found dead, weeks or months later, in places that raised more questions than they answered. Some were never found at all, despite extensive searches over terrain that is, in absolute terms, not that vast. The range covers roughly 160,000 acres. That is large by park standards, but it is not the Alaskan interior. Search and rescue teams working these mountains have covered the same ground repeatedly and still come up empty, and the disappearances have never fully stopped. They continued through the 20th century. They continued into the 21st. There were multiple cases in the span of just a few years around 2009 to 2012 that drew national media attention and prompted formal public warnings from Arizona officials. Before we go any further into all of that, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you tonight? What does the sky look like from where you are right now? Are you somewhere warm, with a window open and the sound of the night coming through, or somewhere cold, with the dark pressing close against the glass? Maybe you're lying down. Maybe you're somewhere quiet and still, and the idea of a mountain range rising out of a hot desert feels very far away from wherever you are. That distance is part of what makes this kind of story worth telling slowly. The superstitions are real, specific, physical, and measurable. But they are also the kind of place that reaches across distance and does something to your imagination even before you have set foot anywhere near them. If this is the kind of storytelling that you find yourself returning to, I would be genuinely grateful if you liked this video and subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It is a small thing, but it helps this quiet corner of the world find more people who might appreciate sitting with a strange story for a while. There is no rush here. We're going to take our time with this one, now. The superstitions from the valley floor look almost theatrical, as I mentioned. There is something about their profile that seems exaggerated, like a landscape designed to communicate danger visually. The ridgelines are not smooth. They are broken and angular, full of sudden drops and unexpected formations. One of the most distinctive features of the range is a volcanic plug called Weaver's Needle, which rises to about 4,553 feet and is visible from much of the surrounding terrain. It stands separate from the main ridgeline, a tall, narrow column of rock that catches the light differently from the material around it, and it has become, over the years, the single most talked about landmark in the entire mythology of these mountains. We will come back to Weaver's Needle at length, because it sits at the centre of the most persistent story the superstitions have ever generated. But that story, the one about gold and a lost mine and a man called Jacob Waltz, is not where this begins. It is not even close to where this begins. The superstitions were already a place with a specific character long before any prospector arrived with a pickaxe and a theory. The geology of the range is ancient and violent in origin. The rock you see when you look at those ridgelines is primarily welded tuff, the compressed and hardened remnant of a massive volcanic event that occurred roughly 29 million years ago. This was not a simple eruption. The range was formed from the collapse of a large caldera, a catastrophic event that deposited enormous quantities of volcanic material across the region. What remains today is hard, fractured, and deceptive. The surface looks solid but gives way in places. The canyons cut through it are deep and narrow, and the walls are not always as stable as they appear. Even before you add heat, or limited water, or the disorienting similarity of the ridgelines, or the compressed mythology of 150 years of treasure hunting, the terrain itself is a serious proposition. This is a place that asks something specific of anyone who enters it, and it has always been a place that responded poorly when that ask was ignored. The Apache understood this, though they understood it in terms that the Anglo settlers who arrived in the mid-1800s were not prepared to take seriously. The Western Apache, specifically the people who had become the Yavapai Apache Nation, had a relationship with the superstitions that was not simply one of avoidance. It was more nuanced than that. The mountains were considered sacred and powerful, a place with its own spiritual authority. There were protocols for entering. There were stories about what the mountains contained and what they demanded. One of the most persistent of those stories involved a spirit sometimes described in English as the Thunder God, a powerful presence believed to inhabit the range and to punish those who entered without proper understanding or respect. Apache oral tradition also described the mountains as connected to the lower world, an entrance to a realm beneath the surface of the ordinary landscape. These were not idle stories. They encoded real knowledge about a real place, knowledge about how to behave there, how to read the terrain, how to survive it. Early US Army reports from the 1860s and 1870s contain references to Apache guides who refused to enter certain areas of the superstitions. These were experienced men, people who knew the desert landscape of central Arizona as well as anyone alive at the time, and they drew lines. That detail tends to get buried in later retellings, which focus on the gold and the mystery and the bodies. But it is worth holding on to. The people who knew this place best, who had generations of accumulated knowledge about its specific dangers and its specific character, treated it with a particular kind of seriousness. When the prospectors arrived, they did not. Some of those prospectors disappeared. That is the core tension of the Superstition Mountains, and it has not changed much in 150 years. The range sits close to a major American city. It is mapped, managed, and visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year, and it still takes people, not constantly, not inevitably, but persistently, in ways that do not always submit to clean explanation. The deaths and disappearances here range from the straightforwardly tragic, people who underestimated the heat and ran out of water, to the genuinely puzzling, people who vanished in areas that were subsequently searched thoroughly and yielded nothing. What makes this place worth spending a long evening with is not just the mystery, though the mystery is real. It is the specific combination of things that the superstitions contain: geology, history, cultural weight, a particular kind of human obsession, and a landscape that interacts with all of those things in ways that are still producing consequences today. The mountains are not simply a backdrop for stories. They are, in some sense, a participant in them. Before we can fully understand what has happened to people in these mountains and why it keeps happening, we need to understand what kind of place this actually is. Not in the mythological sense, not yet, but in the physical, geological, environmental sense. The land itself is the first explanation for everything that follows, and it is a more complete explanation than most people realize. So let us start with the rock itself, because the rock is where everything begins. The Superstition Mountains are volcanic in origin, and not in the gentle, gradual way that some ranges accumulate over time. Roughly 29 million years ago, a massive caldera system collapsed in this part of what is now central Arizona. The event deposited enormous volumes of material across the region, material that compressed under heat and pressure into what geologists call welded tuff. It is a rock type that looks, from a distance, like ordinary stone. Solid, reliable, the kind of thing you would trust your weight to without much thought. Up close, and especially underfoot, it is something else. Welded tuff is hard but fractured throughout, laced with cracks and fissures that are not always visible until you are standing on a section that decides to shift. The surface layer in many parts of the range is loose and crumbly, sitting on top of that harder substrate like a thin, unreliable crust. Experienced climbers know to test each foothold. People who are new to this terrain, or who are moving quickly because they are dehydrated or disoriented or in a hurry to reach somewhere before dark, often do not. The canyon system that cuts through the range is a direct product of this geology. Over millions of years, water and erosion worked through the fractured tuff and carved out a network of drainages that are in places narrow, deep, and poorly mapped even now. Some of these canyons run for miles without widening. The walls can rise steeply on both sides, blocking views of the surrounding terrain and making it genuinely difficult to track your own position relative to where you started. If you have ever been in a slot canyon in the American Southwest, you have some sense of the enclosed, disorienting quality these spaces can produce. The Superstition canyons are not always that extreme, but the effect is similar. You lose the horizon. Landmarks you are using to navigate disappear behind canyon walls. The light changes quality and direction in ways that can make it hard to tell what time of day it is or which way you are facing. The ridgeline above those canyons present a different problem. From a distance, the superstitions look dramatic and distinctive, all jagged edges and broken profiles. But once you're inside the range, moving along those ridgelines or trying to navigate from one to another, they begin to look remarkably similar to each other. The welded tuff weathers in consistent patterns, producing formations that repeat across the range with just enough variation to seem like landmarks, but not enough variation to reliably distinguish them from one another. Hikers who have spent years in the Superstitions describe the specific experience of being certain they recognize a rock formation, following it, and discovering they have gone in entirely the wrong direction. The light makes this worse. In the morning, certain ridge lines are lit from the east and appear one way. By afternoon, the same ridge lines are in shadow and appear completely different. A feature you used as a reference point at 9 in the morning may be unrecognisable at 3 in the afternoon. This is not a subtle problem. It is one of the specific documented mechanisms by which experienced hikers have become seriously lost in this range. Then there is the heat. The Superstitions sit within the Sonoran Desert, and the lower elevations of the range, particularly the canyon floors, experience some of the most extreme summer temperatures in North America. During June, July and August, temperatures in these canyons regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. On some days, they push closer to 115. There is almost no shade in the lower terrain. The canyon walls absorb heat during the day and radiate it back through the afternoon and into the evening, so the temperature does not drop meaningfully until well after dark. A person hiking in these conditions is losing water at a rate that most people significantly underestimate. In dry desert heat, the body can lose a litre of water per hour through sweat alone. And because the air is so dry, that sweat evaporates almost immediately, which means you do not always feel as wet or as hot as you actually are. The sensation of overheating comes later than it should, which means by the time you feel seriously unwell, you are already in trouble. The water situation in the Superstitions is specifically treacherous because of how it appears on maps. Some older maps and trail guides show water sources, springs, and seasonal pools at various points in the range. Some of those sources still exist. Many of them have dried up, or they run only for a few weeks after winter rain and snow melt, or they exist only in years with above-average precipitation. Peralta Canyon has some seasonal pools that can hold water into late spring, but by June they are typically gone. The Dutchman's Trail, one of the most heavily used routes in the range, crosses terrain where water sources are sparse and unreliable. People who plan a hike based on an old map that shows a spring at mile 7 may arrive at mile 7 and find nothing but dry rock. At that point they are already deep in the range, already tired, already using more water than they anticipated, and the trailhead is several miles behind them. The 3 main trails that bring most visitors into the range each have their own character and their own specific risks. The Peralta Trail is probably the most visited. It runs roughly 2.5 miles from the Peralta Trailhead up to Fremont Saddle, gaining about 1,300 feet in elevation along the way. The trail is well maintained for most of its length, and offers one of the most dramatic views in the range from the saddle, a direct sightline to Weaver's Needle. But the elevation gain is steep and relentless, and the trail is fully exposed for most of its length. In summer, hiking the Peralta Trail in the middle of the day is genuinely dangerous, and rangers and experienced locals say so clearly. The Dutchman's Trail is longer, roughly 21 miles end to end if you walk the full route between trailheads, and it takes you deep into the interior of the range. It passes through terrain that feels increasingly remote as you move away from the trailheads, and it crosses several drainages that can be flowing or completely dry depending on the season. The Black Mesa Trail is shorter and less dramatic, but runs across open terrain where the sun exposure is nearly constant, and the disorientation from repeating ridgelines is particularly pronounced. The monsoon season adds a different dimension to all of this. In Arizona, the monsoon typically arrives between July and September, bringing thunderstorms that can be sudden, intense, and localized. In the Superstitions, these storms feed into the canyon drainages and can produce flash floods with very little warning. The mechanics of a flash flood in a narrow canyon are worth understanding, because the experience is nothing like what the word flood might suggest. The rain that causes the flood may not be falling anywhere near you. It may be falling miles away, on a ridge, or in a distant drainage that feeds into the canyon you're walking through. The water arrives fast, often as a wall moving through the canyon, carrying debris, rock, and whatever else was in the drainage above. People caught in flash floods in narrow canyons have very few options. The walls are steep, the water is powerful, the warning time, if there is any, is measured in seconds. The deaths of Vardy and Charles and Malcolm Meeks in October 2010 are believed to have involved conditions consistent with flash flooding and exposure. They were found dead after disappearing in the range, and the specific circumstances of their deaths were consistent with the kind of rapid environmental deterioration that the monsoon season can produce. Their case is one of several that illustrate how quickly conditions in the superstitions can move from manageable to fatal, not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of terrain, heat, water loss, disorientation, and weather combining in ways that leave very little margin. Navigation technology has improved some of this, but not as much as people assume. GPS devices and smartphone navigation apps work well in open terrain, but inside the canyon system the signal can be blocked or degraded by the canyon walls. Battery life is a real concern in extreme heat, because high temperatures accelerate battery drain significantly. A phone that would last a full day of navigation in mild weather may give out after a few hours in a canyon at 110 degrees. Paper maps help, but only if you know how to use them, and only if you can identify enough landmarks to establish your position, which, as we discussed, is genuinely difficult in terrain where the ridgelines repeat and the light shifts the appearance of everything. There is also a compass problem in the superstitions that is worth mentioning, because it comes up repeatedly in accounts from hikers and has a real geological explanation. The volcanic rock in the range contains significant deposits of magnetite, an iron-bearing mineral that is naturally magnetic. Magnetite deposits can affect compass readings by pulling the needle away from true magnetic north. This is a documented phenomenon in volcanic terrain around the world, and it is specifically relevant in the superstitions, where the concentration of volcanic material is high. A hiker relying on a compass for navigation in the interior of the range may find that the compass is giving them slightly or significantly inaccurate readings, depending on where they are standing and what is in the rock beneath them. This does not make navigation impossible, but it does mean that a tool people trust as inherently reliable may not be fully reliable here. All of this, the fractured geology, the canyon system, the heat, the unreliable water sources, the disorienting ridgelines, the flash floods, the compass interference, adds up to a place that is genuinely, specifically, technically dangerous in ways that are not always obvious from the outside. From the valley floor, or from a trailhead parking lot in the early morning, the superstitions look like a dramatic but manageable wilderness area. They are close to Phoenix. They are inside a national forest. They have marked trails and posted warning signs and a ranger presence. They feel accessible in the way that managed outdoor spaces feel accessible. And they are accessible in the sense that you can walk into them without special equipment or permits. But accessible and safe are not the same thing, and the superstitions are a place where that distinction has been demonstrated over and over again across more than a century of documented incidents. The terrain does not become less dangerous because it is close to a city. The heat does not become less extreme because there is a parking lot nearby. The canyons do not become more forgiving because someone put up a trail marker at the entrance. What makes this particularly relevant to everything that follows is that the physical danger of the superstitions is the foundation on which all the other layers of the story rest. The disappearances, the deaths, the mythology, the treasure hunting culture, the search and rescue operations, the paranormal claims, all of it is built on top of a landscape that is, at its most basic level, a genuinely hostile environment for human beings who are not prepared for it. The geology and the climate are the first explanation. They are not the only explanation, and they do not account for everything that has happened in these mountains. But any honest account of the superstitions has to start here, with the rock and the heat and the water and the canyons, because these are the things that were killing people long before anyone invented a story about a lost gold mine. The land itself is the first explanation for what happens here. It is a more complete explanation than most people who come looking for mystery are willing to accept. But it is not the whole story, and the people who have spent time in these mountains, the rangers, the search and rescue teams, the long-time residents of Apache Junction, will tell you that themselves. There is something about the specific combination of physical danger and accumulated mythology in this place that produces outcomes that the terrain alone does not fully predict. The geology explains many of the deaths. It does not explain all of them. And it does not explain why people keep coming, keep searching, keep pushing past the point where any reasonable calculation of risk would tell them to stop. To understand that, we have to go back further. Before the treasure hunters, before the prospectors, before the Anglo settlers who named this range for the warnings they did not fully understand, there were people here who knew these mountains in a different way. And what they knew, and what they said about this place, is where the longer story actually begins. The people who knew these mountains first were not settlers, not prospectors, not soldiers. They were the Western Apache, and their relationship with this range was old in ways that defy easy summary. The Yavapai Apache Nation, whose ancestral territory includes the land around and within the Superstitions, had been living in and moving through this region for centuries before any European presence in the American Southwest. And their understanding of the mountains was not a simple thing. It was not, as the later Anglo settlers assumed, a superstitious fear of an unknown place. It was something considerably more layered than that. The Western Apache did not universally avoid the superstitions. That is a simplification that the settlers reached because it was convenient and because it fit the story they were already building. The reality was more specific. The mountains were considered a place that required particular protocols, particular respect. There were portions of the range that were treated as sacred, and like many sacred places in many cultures, they were not places you wandered into casually or without purpose. You approached them correctly, or you did not approach them at all. That distinction matters, because it is the difference between a people who feared a place and a people who understood one. The Apache oral tradition describes the Superstitions as a place with genuine spiritual weight. One of the most persistent elements of that tradition involves what is sometimes described in English as the thunder god, a powerful spirit understood to inhabit the mountains and to have a particular relationship with those who entered without the right intention or the right conduct. The name Thunder God is an approximation, a translation that loses nuance in the crossing from Apache language and worldview into English. But the essential idea has been recorded consistently enough across different accounts that it is worth taking seriously as a description of how the Apache understood this landscape. The mountains were not empty. They were inhabited in a way that demanded acknowledgement. There is also a specific element of Apache oral tradition that describes the Superstitions as a kind of threshold. Some accounts describe the mountains as containing an entrance to the lower world, a place beneath the surface of the physical landscape where other powers and other realities existed. This is not unique to Apache cosmology. Many indigenous traditions across North America describe specific geographic features as points of connection between the visible world and other realms, and these descriptions are usually not metaphorical in the way that outsiders tend to read them. They are literal accounts of how the landscape was understood to function. The Superstitions in this framework were not just dangerous terrain, they were a boundary, a place where the ordinary rules of the world were subject to revision. Early accounts from the United States Army dating to the 1860s and 1870s document something that the officers writing those reports did not fully understand but recorded anyway. Apache guides, men who were willing to lead patrols through extremely difficult and genuinely dangerous terrain elsewhere in the region, would refuse to enter certain areas of the Superstitions. These refusals were noted in field reports with a mixture of frustration and mild bewilderment. The officers interpreted the reluctance as superstition, in the dismissive sense of the word, as irrational fear, as evidence that the Apache were being unreasonably cautious about terrain that any experienced soldier could handle. This interpretation says more about the officers than it does about the Apache. What is actually documented in those reports is that people with extensive generational knowledge of this specific landscape were making deliberate decisions not to enter certain parts of it. That is worth sitting with for a moment. These were not people who were afraid of mountains in general. They were not people who avoided difficult terrain. They were people who knew this particular range in extraordinary detail and who had concluded, based on that knowledge, that certain areas were not to be entered without a very specific kind of preparation and purpose. The army officers who dismissed those refusals as superstition were operating on the assumption that their own confidence in the terrain was better founded than the Apache's caution. The subsequent history of the superstitions suggests that assumption was not well placed. The name itself is a record of this misunderstanding. When Anglo settlers began moving into the region in the mid-1800s, they noticed that the Apache treated the range with a particular kind of care. They heard the warnings, they observed the reluctance, and rather than trying to understand what those warnings were actually communicating, they reached for the word that felt most available to them: superstition. It was a word that let them acknowledge the Apache response to the mountains without taking it seriously. It let them say, essentially, that the Apache were afraid of something that was not real, that the warnings were the product of primitive belief rather than accumulated knowledge. The name stuck. The mountains have carried it ever since. There is a quiet irony in this that is hard to ignore when you look at the full record of what has happened in these mountains over the century and a half since they were named. The people who gave the mountains their name because they thought the Apache were being unreasonably cautious about the terrain went on to disappear in that terrain at a rate that has continued with remarkable consistency ever since. The warnings were not taken seriously. The people who issued them understood something that the settlers did not, and the mountains went on being what they had always been. It would be easy to frame this purely as a lesson about cultural arrogance, and it is partly that, but it is also something more specific. The Apache warnings were not vague. They were not simply expressions of general unease about a wild place. They were specific enough that army guides would identify particular areas as off-limits, specific enough that oral tradition preserved detailed accounts of what happened to people who entered incorrectly, specific enough that the warnings were consistent across multiple accounts recorded by different observers over several decades. Whatever the Apache knew about the superstitions, they knew it in detail. Some of that knowledge was almost certainly practical. People who have lived in close relationship with the landscape for generations develop an understanding of its dangers that is not always translatable into the kind of explicit technical language that outsiders find convincing. They know where the flash floods come through with the least warning. They know which drainages dry up and when. They know which ridgelines will disorient you and which rock formations are unstable. They know where the heat collects and where the water does not. This kind of knowledge is not superstition. It is the product of long observation and real experience, and it tends to be accurate in ways that matter when your life depends on it. But the Apache understanding of the superstitions was not only practical in that narrow sense. The spiritual dimension was real to them, and it shaped how they interacted with the landscape in ways that, whatever you believe about the underlying cosmology, produced behavioral outcomes that were genuinely protective. If you believe that a place demands respect and specific conduct, you will approach it more carefully. You will be more attentive. You will be less likely to push past the point where your own limitations are telling you to stop. The Thunder God tradition, whatever its metaphysical status, functioned as a set of behavioral guidelines for engaging with a dangerous environment, and those guidelines were the product of generations of experience with what that environment actually does to people. The settlers who named the mountain superstition did not have that framework. They came in with confidence, with tools, with the particular kind of certainty that comes from believing that the physical world is a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be navigated. Some of them were skilled and experienced in their own right. Some of them survived. Some of them did not. and the ones who did not disappear into the historical record alongside the Apache warnings they had chosen to dismiss. It is worth noting that the transition from Apache knowledge to settler encounter was not instantaneous or clean. There were people in the mid to late 1800s who did try to understand what the Apache were communicating about the mountains, who asked questions and listened to the answers. But the broader cultural momentum was not in their direction. The gold rushes of the 1840s and 1850s had created a specific kind of appetite in the American West, a hunger for discovery and extraction that did not leave much room for caution. Men who were already willing to cross entire continents in search of gold were not going to be stopped by warnings from people whose culture they had largely decided to disregard. The Apache told them the mountains were dangerous in ways that went beyond the obvious. The prospectors went in anyway, and the disappearances began. This is where the two threads of the superstition story, the physical and the cultural, begin to weave together in a way that has never fully come apart. The physical danger of the mountains is real and well documented. The cultural warnings about those mountains are also real and well documented, even if their interpretation has been contested. What the Apache were communicating when they warned people away from certain areas was not simply that the terrain was difficult, it was that the terrain was difficult in a specific way that required a specific kind of respect and preparation, and that people who came in without that respect and preparation tended to fare badly. That is not a supernatural claim. It is an empirical observation. And the record of the superstitions, from the first documented disappearances in the 19th century through to the cluster of deaths in the early 21st, is consistent with that observation in a way that is hard to dismiss. The Apache did not disappear from this story when the settlers arrived, though the settlers behaved as though they had. The Yavapai Apache nation still exists. Their connection to this land is still real, still documented, still part of the living history of the region. The mountains that Anglo settlers named for the warnings they did not understand are still called home by people whose ancestors knew them before any prospector ever walked a canyon looking for gold. That continuity matters, not as a sentimental footnote, but as a practical fact. The knowledge that was encoded in the warnings, the specific, detailed, experientially grounded knowledge of what this landscape does to people, did not vanish when the settlers arrived. It simply stopped being consulted. What makes the Apache relationship to the superstitions particularly significant to the larger story of disappearances and deaths in the range is not the supernatural element, though that element has its own kind of resonance. It is the consistency. The warnings were specific, the warnings were repeated, the warnings were issued by people with deep generational knowledge of the terrain, and the warnings were ignored by people who then went on to experience exactly the kinds of outcomes the warnings described. That pattern did not begin with the lost Dutchman, and it did not end with the last documented disappearance. It is a pattern that has been running, with variations, for over 150 years. The Thunder God legend, the entrance to the lower world, the protocols for approaching sacred ground, these are not just folklore. They are the cultural form in which real knowledge about a real place was preserved and transmitted. You do not have to accept the cosmological framework to recognize that the behavioral guidelines it produced were grounded in something accurate about the mountains. The Apache knew that this place was dangerous in ways that went beyond the obvious. They encoded that knowledge in a form that was meant to last, that was meant to be taken seriously, that was meant to keep people from making the kinds of decisions that get people killed. The settlers who named the mountain superstition thought they were labeling someone else's irrationality. They were actually, without knowing it, recording their own refusal to listen. And it is into that space, the space created by that refusal, that the next layer of the story moves. Because after the Apache warnings were dismissed, after the settlers began moving through the range in earnest, the mountains received a new kind of attention. Not the careful, respectful attention of people who understood the terrain. The frantic, gold-hungry attention of people who had heard a story about a mine and who believed with the particular conviction of treasure hunters in every era that they were the ones who were finally going to find it. The Spanish colonial period and the legend of the Peralta family were about to give the superstitions a mythology that would prove, in its own way, as durable as anything the Apache had ever said about them. And far more dangerous to the people who believed it. The Peralta family story is one of those legends that has been told so many times, in so many versions, that it has acquired a kind of solidity it does not entirely deserve. It feels like history. It has the texture of history. It has names, dates, a dramatic ending, physical artifacts, and a cast of characters with motivations that make intuitive sense. But when you look closely at the documentation, or rather at the absence of it, the story begins to behave less like a historical record and more like a very well-constructed piece of folklore that someone at some point decided to treat as fact. The core of the legend goes roughly like this. A Mexican family named Peralta had been mining gold in the Superstition Mountains since the early 1800s, operating a rich vein somewhere in the interior of the range. In 1848, a large party of Peralta miners, somewhere between a few dozen and several hundred depending on the telling, were heading out of the mountains with their gold when they were ambushed by Apache warriors. The massacre was devastating. Most of the miners were killed. The mine was abandoned. The gold stayed in the mountains, and the Peralta family, or at least the survivors, returned to Mexico, carrying with them the knowledge of where the mine was located but never going back to claim it. It is a vivid story. It has the shape of a tragedy, which is part of why it sticks. A fortune, nearly reached, then violently interrupted. A secret preserved by violence and time. A location that could theoretically be found again by anyone with the right information. The story contains within it the implicit promise that the mine is still there, waiting, and that the only thing standing between a searcher and extraordinary wealth is the right combination of knowledge, courage, and luck. The problem is that historians have spent considerable effort looking for documentation of the Peralta mining operation in the Superstitions, and they have found very little that holds up to scrutiny. There are records of a Peralta family in Sonora, Mexico, with involvement in various mining ventures during the 19th century. There is a Miguel Peralta who appears in some historical records and whose name became attached to the legend. But solid, verifiable documentation of a Peralta mining operation specifically in the Superstition Mountains, of the scale and duration the legend describes, has not emerged in any archive that historians have been able to examine. The massacre of 1848, which is presented in many tellings as a specific historical event with a specific location, does not appear in army records, Mexican records, or Apache oral tradition in a form that matches the legend. None of this means the legend is entirely invented from nothing. It is possible that some version of the Peralta story has a kernel of historical truth. Mexican miners were active throughout the Southwest in the early and middle 19th century, and encounters with Apache were real and sometimes violent. It is not impossible that some mining activity occurred in or near the Superstitions during this period. But the specific, detailed, cinematic version of the story, the one that became the foundation of the Lost Dutchman mythology, appears to have been substantially constructed and embellished over time, assembled from fragments of plausible history and shaped into something more dramatic and more useful for the purposes of treasure hunting. Then came the Peralta stones, and things got considerably stranger. In 1949, a man named Travis Tumlinson claimed to have found a set of carved stone tablets near Blythe, California. Not in Arizona, not in or near the Superstitions, in Blythe, California, which is roughly 175 miles west of Phoenix, on the other side of the Colorado River. The stones were unusual objects carved with what appeared to be maps, symbols, crosses, and Spanish text. They were eventually interpreted by treasure hunters and enthusiasts as maps to the Peralta mine in the Superstitions, a kind of stone-carved treasure guide left behind by the mining family before or after the massacre. There are 4 main stones in the set, sometimes referred to by names like the Heart Map and the Horse Camp Map. They were studied, photographed, debated, and taken very seriously by a significant portion of the treasure hunting community. Books were written about them. Expeditions were organised based on interpretations of what they showed. The stones became physical evidence, in the minds of those who believed in them, that the Peralta legend was real and that the mine could be found. The skeptical case against the stones is substantial. Professional archaeologists and historians who examined them found no evidence that they were genuinely pre-20th century artifacts. The carving style, the type of stone, and certain details of the inscriptions were inconsistent with what one would expect from authentic colonial-era artifacts. The location where they were found, Blythe, California, makes very little sense as a place where a Mexican mining family would have left maps to a mine in Arizona. The consensus among serious researchers is that the stones were almost certainly made in the 20th century, possibly as an elaborate hoax, possibly as a kind of folk art project that took on a life its creator never intended, and possibly with deliberate intent to mislead treasure hunters. Who made them, and why, has never been definitively established. That ambiguity has been enough to keep them in the conversation. What is perhaps most interesting about the Peralta stones is not whether they are genuine, which they almost certainly are not, but what they reveal about the psychology of the treasure hunting culture that embraced them. The stones appeared at a moment when interest in the lost Dutchman mine was already high, when the legend had been circulating for decades and had accumulated a community of devoted searchers. They arrived as physical confirmation of what people already wanted to believe, and that is a very powerful thing. Physical objects that appear to confirm an existing belief are extraordinarily difficult to dislodge from that belief, even when the evidence against their authenticity is strong. The Peralta stones gave the legend something it had previously lacked, something you could hold in your hands, something that could be photographed and measured and argued over, something that made the mine feel real in a new way. And so the stones were incorporated into the mythology, and the mythology grew, and the people who believed in it went into the mountains in greater numbers and with greater conviction. It is worth pausing here to think about what this actually means in practical terms, because the Peralta story is not just a historical curiosity, it is a mechanism. It is the mechanism by which a vague rumour about gold in the superstitions was transformed into a specific, detailed, seemingly documented narrative that gave treasure hunters a framework, a goal, and a sense of historical legitimacy for their searches. The legend told them that the gold was definitely there, that it had been found before, that it was findable again, and that the only obstacle was locating the specific spot where the Peralta family had been working. It made the search feel like a puzzle with a solution rather than a fantasy, with no anchor in reality. That transformation matters enormously when you're trying to understand why people have been going into the superstitions and dying there for well over a century. The Peralta story did not just attract treasure hunters, it attracted a specific kind of treasure hunter, one who believed they were not chasing a rumour, but following a historical trail. That belief changed behaviour. It made people more willing to take risks, to go farther, to stay longer, to push into terrain they should have turned back from, because they felt they were close to something real. The legend gave the mountains a gravitational pull that raw terrain alone could not have produced. There is also something worth noting about the timing of the Peralta legend's rise to prominence. The story began circulating seriously in the latter half of the 19th century, which is precisely the period when the American West was being settled, when mining booms were creating fortunes and bankruptcies in equal measure, and when the cultural appetite for stories about hidden treasure was at a particular peak. The Peralta narrative fit that appetite perfectly. It had everything the moment required. A lost mine, a dramatic massacre, a specific location, a family connection that could theoretically be traced, and enough historical ambiguity to prevent anyone from definitively disproving it. It was the right story for the right time, and the right time never quite ended. By the time Jacob Waltz arrived in Arizona in the 1860s, the Peralta legend was already in circulation, already shaping how people thought about gold in the superstitions. Waltz did not invent the idea of a hidden mine in the mountains. He inherited a cultural context in which such a mine was already believed to exist, and when he began making his own claims about gold in the superstitions, those claims landed in soil that had been prepared for them. The Peralta story was the framework. Waltz became the proof, or at least he became the story that people told as proof. The connection between the Peralta legend and the lost Dutchman mythology is not incidental, it is structural. Without the Peralta story, Waltz's vague deathbed descriptions would have been much harder to take seriously. They would have been the rambling of an old man, possibly confused, possibly exaggerating, certainly unverifiable. But in the context of a legend that already said there was a rich mine somewhere in the superstitions, Waltz's claims became confirmation. He became the man who had found what the Peralta family had lost. The two stories reinforced each other in a way that made both of them feel more credible than either would have been alone. This is how mythology works, not through a single dramatic moment of invention, but through the slow accumulation of stories that reference and support each other until the whole structure feels solid. The Peralta massacre, the hidden mine, the stone maps, the German prospector who found it again and died with the secret, these are not independent stories. They are layers of the same story, each one making the others feel more real, each one drawing more people into the mountains to search. The irony, and it is a sharp one, is that the Peralta story may be largely fabricated, and the Peralta stones almost certainly are, and yet the consequences of people believing in them are entirely, documentably real. The deaths are real, the disappearances are real, the search and rescue operations are real, the bones found in canyon crevices are real. The legend did not need to be historically accurate to be historically consequential. It needed only to be believed, and it has been believed, with remarkable persistence for over 150 years. There is something almost vertiginous about that. A story that may have been substantially invented, built on a foundation of historical ambiguity and wishful thinking, has sent real people into real mountains where real things have happened to them. The gap between the story and the reality has been bridged entirely by human conviction, by the willingness of people to believe that the mine is there, that it can be found, that they might be the ones to find it. That willingness has not diminished. There are people planning trips into the superstitions right now, carrying printed copies of Peralta stone interpretations, GPS coordinates derived from someone's theory about what the maps mean, and the particular focused energy of someone who believes they are close to something. Some of them are careful and experienced and will return safely. Some of them will get into trouble and be rescued, and some of them, as the record shows, will not come back at all. The Peralta legend created the framework. Jacob Waltz, the lost Dutchman himself, stepped into that framework and became its most enduring figure. His story is in some ways simpler than the Peralta myth, but it is also more intimate, more human, and in its own way more troubling, because Waltz was a real person, and the questions his story raises are real questions. Where did his gold come from? What did he know? What did he say at the end? And what has the search for the answers cost the people who have spent their lives trying to find them? Jacob Waltz was a real man. That is worth saying plainly, because so much of what surrounds his story has the texture of folklore that it can be easy to forget there is a documented human being at the centre of it. He was born in Germany, probably around 1810, though the exact date is uncertain. He emigrated to the United States sometime in the 1840s, became a naturalized citizen, and worked as a prospector in various parts of the American West, before arriving in Arizona Territory around 1863. Census records place him there. Land records confirm his homestead near the Salt River, not far from what would eventually become Phoenix. He was, by all accounts, a quiet and somewhat solitary man. He worked his land, he prospected when he could, and he did not talk freely about where he went or what he found. The nickname Dutchman had nothing to do with the Netherlands. In the 19th century, particularly in the American West, German immigrants were commonly referred to as Dutch, a corruption of the German word Deutsch, which simply means German. Waltz was Deutsch. To his neighbours and acquaintances, he became the Dutchman. The name stuck, travelled forward through time, and eventually became one of the most recognised labels in the entire mythology of the American West, the Lost Dutchman's Mine. It has the sound of something legendary, something that was always going to be a legend, but it began as nothing more than a regional nickname for a German immigrant who kept to himself and occasionally showed up in town with gold. That gold is the first real thread worth pulling. There are accounts, some of them documented in contemporaneous records, and some of them passed down through oral history, that Waltz did bring gold ore into Phoenix on more than one occasion. He reportedly showed samples to people he trusted, and the quality of the ore was said to be high. Not placer gold, the kind you find by panning river gravel, but rich vein ore, the kind that comes from a hard rock deposit. This distinction matters because placer gold was common enough in Arizona at the time, but high-grade vein ore from an unknown source was something different. It suggested a specific location, a specific deposit, something that could be returned to. Where that ore came from has never been confirmed. Waltz never filed a mining claim in the Superstitions, which is notable but not necessarily conclusive. Men who believed they had found something extraordinary sometimes deliberately avoided filing claims, fearing that the paperwork would draw competitors. The absence of a claim is not proof there was no mine. It is also not proof there was one. It is simply an absence, and absences have a way of being filled by imagination. What is documented with somewhat more reliability is the scene at Waltz's deathbed in 1891. He was elderly, in poor health, and living in Phoenix. His neighbour, a woman named Julia Thomas, had been caring for him in his final weeks. She ran a small ice cream parlour and had befriended Waltz over the years. According to her account, which she gave in various forms over the following years, Waltz spoke to her about the mine before he died. He described its location using landmarks. He mentioned a canyon, a specific rock formation, a direction from a recognisable peak. He said there was enough gold there to last several lifetimes. The problem, and it is a significant one, is that Julia Thomas's account was not written down immediately. It was told and retold, and each retelling added a little more detail, smoothed a few rough edges, made the directions a little more specific or a little more evocative, depending on who was doing the telling. By the time the story was being widely circulated in print, which happened most influentially through a 1945 book by Simseli called The Lost Dutchman Mine, the deathbed scene had taken on the quality of a carefully composed narrative. It felt almost too complete, too cinematic, with the old man whispering directions in the lamplight while the woman leaned close to catch every word. That does not mean it didn't happen. It means we should hold it carefully, with the understanding that memory is not a recording device, and that a story told repeatedly over many years tends to become more coherent, not less, even when the original details were fragmentary. Julia Thomas herself went into the Superstitions to search after Waltz died. She found nothing. She sold maps of the supposed mine location to fund further expeditions, which is worth noting, not to condemn her, but to observe that the mine was already becoming an economic object before the 20th century had even begun. What Waltz actually knew, and what he actually said, has been debated ever since. Some researchers who have spent years studying the documentary record believe that Waltz did find a small but rich gold deposit somewhere in the mountains, possibly one that had been worked before, possibly connected in some way to earlier Spanish or Mexican prospecting activity. Others believe that Waltz was a clever and private man who cultivated an air of mystery deliberately, that the gold he showed people came from legitimate but unremarkable sources, and that the mine was a story he allowed to grow around himself without ever quite confirming or denying it. There is a third possibility, quieter and perhaps more melancholy, that Waltz was simply an old man whose memories had become confused, whose sense of geography had blurred with age and illness, and whose deathbed words were taken far more literally than they were intended. None of these explanations can be ruled out. None of them can be proven. The historical record is simply too thin, and too filtered through layers of subsequent mythology to allow any firm conclusion. What can be said is this: the mine, if it existed, has not been found in the 130 plus years since Waltz died, not for lack of trying. The Superstition Mountains have been searched more thoroughly, more repeatedly, and with more determination than almost any comparable piece of American wilderness. People have brought in metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, geological survey equipment, and competing interpretations of Waltz's supposed directions. They have hiked every major trail, and many trails that do not appear on any official map. They have camped in the canyons for weeks. They have studied the geology, cross-referenced historical accounts, and argued endlessly about which rock formation Waltz might have meant when he described a particular landmark. And the mine, if it is there, has not revealed itself. This is a strange fact to sit with. The superstitions cover roughly 160,000 acres, which sounds enormous until you consider that serious searchers have been working this area for well over a century with increasing sophistication. Modern geological surveys have mapped the mineral deposits of the range in considerable detail. There is gold in the superstitions, that much is established. Small amounts have been found in various locations, but nothing approaching the kind of rich, concentrated vein deposit that the legend describes has ever been confirmed. The geologists who have studied the range are by and large skeptical that a major undiscovered deposit exists. The volcanic geology of the range, primarily welded tuff from a caldera collapse roughly 29 million years ago, is not the most promising host rock for the kind of gold deposit the legend describes. And yet the searching continues. It continues because the alternative, accepting that Waltz was either mistaken or mythologized, requires giving up something that has organized the lives of many people for a very long time. The mine is not just a treasure. For the people who have devoted themselves to finding it, it is a purpose. A framework for understanding why they are spending their weekends in a desert canyon in June, why they are studying old photographs and obscure historical documents, why they are measuring distances between rock formations with the focused attention of someone who believes they are one insight away from everything changing. The mine gives the mountains meaning, and meaning once established is not easily surrendered. There is also the matter of what searching for the mine has done to people in the most literal and irreversible sense. Julia Thomas found nothing and eventually moved on, but others who followed her into the mountains did not return. The search for the lost Dutchman's mine has a documented body count, not a large one by the standards of major disasters, but a persistent and specific one. People have died in the superstitions looking for what Jacob Waltz may or may not have found. Some of them died in ways that are straightforwardly explained by the terrain and the climate. Others died in circumstances that raised questions that were never fully answered. The mine did not kill them directly. But the belief in the mine, the willingness to push farther and stay longer and take risks that a person without that belief would not have taken, that belief has been a factor in deaths that are entirely real and entirely documented. Waltz himself lived to the age of approximately 80, which given the conditions of prospecting life in territorial Arizona is not a bad outcome. He died in his bed, in Phoenix, with his neighbor beside him. He was buried in a Phoenix cemetery. His homestead was modest. He did not die rich. If he had found a mine of the kind the legend describes, he either could not return to it in his final years, or he chose not to, or the mine was not quite what the legend grew it into. Any of these possibilities is plausible. All of them leave the central question unanswered. What Waltz left behind was not gold. It was a story, or more precisely, the raw material for a story that other people built into something much larger than anything he appears to have intended. The deathbed scene, the vague directions, the ore samples, the solitary habits, the German immigrant who kept his secrets, all of these details were available to the storytellers who came after him, and they used them well. They combined them with the Peralta legend, with the general mythology of the American West, with the specific visual drama of the Superstition Mountains themselves, and they produce something that has proven extraordinarily durable. It is worth pausing for a moment on the man himself separate from the legend. Jacob Waltz spent roughly 3 decades in Arizona territory. He farmed, he prospected, he lived quietly, he had friends and neighbours, he was known in his community as a capable and self-sufficient man. Whatever he found or did not find in the mountains, his life was not defined by it in the way that the legend would suggest. The legend has a way of reducing him to a single dramatic moment, an old man dying with a secret, but the actual man was more than that. He was a person who lived a long and largely ordinary life in an extraordinary place and time, and the extraordinary part, the mine, the gold, the secret, may have been smaller and more ambiguous than the story that grew around it, but the story is what has mattered, historically speaking. The story is what sent people into the mountains. The story is what continues to send them. And that search, the one that began with Julia Thomas walking into the Superstitions in 1891 and has never really stopped, has accumulated a record of loss that is worth examining carefully. Because whatever one believes about the mine, the losses are not in dispute. They are documented. They are specific. They have names and dates and locations, and in some cases questions that the official records were never quite able to close. The search that Jacob Waltz inspired, whether deliberately or not, has cost more than time and money. It has cost lives, and the accounting of those lives is where the story of the Superstition Mountains becomes something more than legend. The first name worth knowing is Adolph Ruth. He was 66 years old in the summer of 1931, and by most accounts he was not a young 66. He walked with a cane. He had suffered a serious leg injury years earlier that had never fully healed. He was not, in other words, the profile of someone you would send alone into a desert mountain range in June, when temperatures in the lower canyons regularly climb past 110 degrees. But Adolph Ruth had papers. He had documents that he believed, with genuine conviction, pointed to the location of the Peralta mine and by extension to the lost Dutchmans. His son had obtained these papers from a Mexican family in connection with the Peralta legend, and Adolph Ruth had become convinced they were authentic. He had been planning this trip for years. Nothing was going to stop him. He was dropped off near the Superstitions in early June by a rancher who agreed to come back for him later. He went in alone. He had some supplies, some water, and those papers. He did not come back out when expected. A search was organised, and the search found nothing. The mountains, as they have a habit of doing, offered no immediate explanation. Then, in November of that same year, roughly 6 months after he had walked in, searchers found his skull. Not his body, just his skull, about 1.5 miles from where he had been dropped off. The rest of his remains were found about 1/4 mile away, in January of the following year. What made the Adolph Ruth case unusual, and what has kept it circulating in discussions of the superstitions for nearly a century, was the condition of the skull. 2 holes were observed in it. Some people who examined it concluded they were bullet holes, which would have meant Ruth was shot, which would have meant murder. The story spread quickly. It fit neatly into an existing narrative about the mountains protecting their secrets, about the mine's guardian, about dangerous men who did not want competitors. The treasure hunting community seized on it. For a time, it was treated almost as established fact that Ruth had been killed. The medical examiner's conclusion was more cautious. The holes in the skull were not definitively identified as bullet wounds. Bone deteriorates. Animals scatter remains. The desert does things to the dead that can be difficult to interpret months later. The official finding was that the cause of death could not be determined with certainty, but that heat and dehydration were the most likely explanation given the circumstances. He was an elderly man with a mobility impairment, alone in extreme heat, in terrain that defeats much younger and healthier people. The most probable explanation was also the least dramatic one. But the bullet hole story never entirely went away, and it probably never will, because the superstitions have a way of keeping their ambiguities alive. Ruth's notes were found with his remains. they contain the phrase veni, vidi, vici, which people have interpreted in various ways, some romantically, some practically. He had also written what appeared to be directional notes referencing landmarks. None of them led anyone to a mine, but they confirmed that he had gone in looking, that he had been moving through the mountains with purpose, and that whatever he found or did not find, he had died out there believing he was close to something. James Kibler died in the Superstitions in 1946. The details of his case are less documented in the public record, but his death added to the accumulating count. Franz Harrer disappeared in 1958 and was never found, which is its own category of loss, the ones where there is no body, no final location, no physical evidence to close the story. The mountains simply absorbed him. Walter Maury died in 1959 under circumstances that investigators described as consistent with heat exposure and disorientation. These names from the mid-20th century are sometimes treated as a kind of background noise in the larger story. Deaths that are acknowledged but not dwelt upon, overshadowed by the more dramatic narratives around them. That is probably unfair to them as people. Each of them was someone with a life outside the mountains, with reasons for being there, with people who waited for them and were told they were not coming back. The mountains do not distinguish between the famous cases and the forgotten ones. The terrain applies the same indifference to everyone. The cases that drew the most sustained attention in recent memory form a cluster around the years 2009 to 2012, a period during which a series of disappearances occurred, close enough together in time that national media took notice, and Arizona officials felt compelled to issue formal public warnings. It is worth going through these carefully, because they illustrate something important about the range of ways the superstitions can take people. Jesse Capon was 35 years old from Denver, Colorado. He was not an inexperienced outdoorsman, but he was deeply, specifically obsessed with the lost Dutchman mine. He had been to the Superstitions multiple times before the trip from which he did not return. He had studied the legend extensively. He had his own theories about the mine's location. In December of 2009, he went into the mountains and did not come out. Search and rescue teams went in. They covered significant ground. They found nothing. Jesse Capon was missing for nearly 3 years. Then, in November of 2012, searchers found him. He was wedged in a narrow crevice in the rock, roughly 200 feet from an established trail. 200 feet. In a range of 160,000 acres, he was found less than a minute's walk from a path that search teams had almost certainly passed near during earlier operations. The crevice had hidden him completely. His body showed no signs of foul play. The working conclusion was that he had fallen or climbed into the crevice and been unable to get out. He had died there, within earshot of the trail, in a crack in the volcanic rock that the mountains had offered up and then sealed over. The Jesse Capon case is the one that tends to stay with people, and not because it is the most dramatic. It stays with people because of that distance. 200 feet. It is the kind of detail that makes the terrain feel almost deliberate, though of course it is not. The volcanic tuff of the Superstitions is fractured and irregular in ways that create exactly these kinds of hidden spaces, narrow enough to trap a person, deep enough to conceal them, invisible from above and from the trail. Capon was not in some remote and uncharted corner of the range. He was close to where people walk every day, and still it took 3 years to find him. Ardean Charles was 52 years old. Malcolm Meeks was 41. They disappeared together in October of 2010, which immediately distinguished their case from the typical solo disappearance. 2 people going in together, neither coming out. Their bodies were found in a drainage area, and the evidence was consistent with exposure and possibly flash flood. October is the tail end of Arizona's monsoon season, when the desert has been absorbing heat and intermittent heavy rain for months. Drainages that look dry and walkable can fill with fast-moving water in minutes when storms hit the higher elevations. The water does not always announce itself with visible clouds overhead. It can arrive from weather happening miles away, funneled through narrow canyon walls with nowhere to go but forward and fast. Charles and Meeks appear to have been caught in conditions that the mountains can produce without any warning and without any particular malice. Just physics and geography doing what they always do. Curtis Merworth was 41 years old when he disappeared in May of 2010. He went into the Superstitions and did not come back. Extensive searches were conducted. He has never been found. His case remains open in the sense that there is no body, no confirmed location, no physical resolution. He is one of the ranges missing in the most complete sense of that word. The mountains have not returned him. What is notable about the 2009 to 2012 cluster, beyond the individual tragedies, is what it revealed about the pattern. When investigators and rangers looked at these cases together, certain features kept appearing. A significant number of the victims had gone in alone. Many were found to have carried inadequate water for the conditions and the distance they intended to cover. Several had no communication device, or had one with a dead battery. Some had maps that were incomplete or outdated. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, which handles search and rescue operations in the area, noted that the combination of the terrain's difficulty and the mine's mythology was specifically dangerous, because it encouraged people to push farther than they should, to stay out longer than was safe, to take risks that a person simply hiking for recreation would not have taken. The range itself is not enormous by the standards of Western wilderness. 160,000 acres sounds like a lot, and in absolute terms it is, but there are wilderness areas in the American West that are 10 or 20 times that size. The Superstitions are not some vast and trackless expanse. They are a relatively compact mountain range on the eastern edge of the Phoenix metropolitan area, crossed by established trails, managed by the Tonto National Forest, visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year. Most of those visitors go in and come out without incident. The mountains are not uniformly deadly. They are not waiting to take everyone who enters, but they are unforgiving in specific ways, at specific times, under specific conditions. The heat is not a gentle inconvenience. It is a physiological assault that begins affecting decision-making before most people realize it's happening. The terrain is fractured and disorienting in ways that GPS and trail markers do not fully solve. The water sources are unreliable. The crevices and drop-offs are real. And the mythology, the specific, powerful, deeply embedded mythology of the Lost Dutchman mine, has a demonstrated capacity to override the judgment of people who would otherwise be sensible and careful. The deaths and disappearances documented across more than a century add up to a number that is hard to pin down precisely, because not all of them are officially attributed to the Superstitions, and historical records from the earlier decades are incomplete. Estimates vary. Some researchers have counted dozens of deaths specifically connected to treasure hunting or to unexplained disappearances in the range. Others count only the cases with clear documentation, which brings the number lower, but no less significant. What is not in dispute is that the deaths have continued across generations, that they have involved people of different ages and backgrounds and levels of experience, and that they have not stopped. There is also a subset of cases that sit in a more uncomfortable category, the ones where the circumstances were unusual enough that the official explanations felt incomplete to the people who were paying attention. Adolf Ruth's skull is the most famous example, but he is not the only one. There have been cases where remains were found in locations that searchers had previously covered, which raises questions about how they were missed. There have been cases where the physical evidence was ambiguous enough that investigators declined to make a definitive ruling on cause of death. These cases are not numerous, and they should not be overstated. The vast majority of deaths in the Superstitions have explanations that are entirely consistent with the terrain, the climate, and human error. But the ambiguous ones exist, and they contribute to the atmosphere of unresolved questions that has always surrounded this range. What the record shows, taken as a whole, is a place that has been killing people in a slow, specific, and consistent way for well over 100 years. Not in dramatic mass events, not in sudden catastrophes, but one by one, across seasons and decades, in ways that are sometimes explained and sometimes not, in ways that are sometimes straightforward and sometimes strange. The mountains have not changed. The terrain is the same volcanic tuff it was when Jacob Waltz was prospecting through it in the 1870s. The heat is the same. The crevices are the same. The drainages that flood without warning are the same. What has changed is the number of people who come looking and the specific thing many of them are looking for. The legend has grown larger with each generation that has added to it. The community of searchers has become more organised, more connected, more convinced. The infrastructure around the mythology, the festivals, the museums, the online forums, the published maps and competing theories has made the mountains more accessible in some ways while doing nothing to make them less dangerous in the ways that actually matter. People arrive better informed about the legend than they are about the terrain. They arrive knowing the name Weaver's Needle but not knowing what flash flood season looks like from inside a canyon drainage. They arrive with a mine in their minds and the heat at their backs and a confidence that the search has earned them, a confidence that the mountains have no particular interest in honouring. The documented losses are the part of the Superstition Mountains story that resist romanticisation, or should. The legend is romantic, the landscape is dramatic, the history is layered and genuinely interesting, but the names, Adolph Ruth, Jesse Capon, Curtis Merworth, Ardean Charles, Malcolm Meeks, and the others who are less remembered or never fully accounted for, those names are the weight that the story carries. They are the evidence that whatever else the superstitions are, they're also a place where people go and do not return, and where the explanation for that is sometimes clear and sometimes not, and where the search for the mine has functioned across more than a century as a mechanism for drawing people into conditions that can kill them. The practical question then is how? Not why in the philosophical sense, but how, specifically and mechanically, does a mountain range that is well mapped, well managed, and located 40 miles from a major American city continue to defeat people in the ways it does? The answer to that question requires going deeper into the terrain itself, into the specific ways heat and geography and the human body interact in the superstitions, because the mechanics of how people die and disappear, they are as important as the record of the fact that they do. So let us go there, into the mechanics of it, into the specific, unglamorous, physiological reality of what happens to a person inside the Superstition Mountains when things begin to go wrong. The heat is the place to start, because it is the most consistent factor in the documented deaths, and because it operates in ways that are not always intuitive until you understand the biology behind it. The Sonoran desert floor in summer regularly reaches 110 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes higher. Inside the lower canyons of the Superstitions, where rock walls absorb heat through the day and radiate it back through the afternoon and evening, the effective temperature can feel even more extreme. There is very little shade in the lower elevations. The saguaro cacti that cover the slopes do not provide it. The canyon walls, depending on their orientation, may block the sun for parts of the day but concentrate reflected heat in ways that make the air feel thick and close. What heat does to the human body, specifically to the human brain, is the part of this that matters most for understanding the disappearances. Heat illness does not arrive all at once. It progresses in stages, and the dangerous thing about those stages is that the person experiencing them is often the last to recognise what is happening. Early dehydration causes fatigue, mild headache, and a slight reduction in concentration. These are easy to dismiss, especially in someone who is motivated, excited, and focused on a goal. A person looking for a gold mine is not going to stop and think carefully about whether they feel slightly off. They're going to keep walking. As dehydration worsens and core body temperature rises, the effects become more significant. Cognitive function degrades in measurable ways. Studies on heat stress and decision-making have found that performance on tasks requiring judgment, spatial reasoning, and risk assessment declines well before a person reaches the clinical threshold for heat stroke. In other words, by the time the superstition's heat is seriously affecting someone's ability to make good decisions, that person is still walking around, still feels capable, and still believes they are thinking clearly. They are not. Disorientation sets in. Not the dramatic movie-style confusion where a person staggers and falls, but a quieter, more insidious version where the mental map they have been building starts to lose coherence. Landmarks that seem distinct begin to blur together. The ridgeline they were using for navigation looks, from a slightly different angle, identical to the ridgeline 2 drainages over. The trail they were following fades into a wash, and they choose the wrong branch without fully registering that they have made a choice at all. They keep moving because movement feels purposeful. Stopping feels like failure. There is a documented phenomenon in heat stroke cases called paradoxical undressing, where a person removes their clothing despite being dangerously overheated. The mechanism is not fully understood, but one explanation involves the sensation of burning skin caused by peripheral vasodilation, where blood rushes to the surface of the body in an attempt to cool it, creating a paradoxical feeling of intense heat, even as core temperature climbs to dangerous levels. Hikers have been found in the superstitions and in other desert environments, with their clothing removed and neatly folded nearby, or simply dropped. It is a marker of a late-stage heat illness, the point where the body's cooling system is failing and the brain is no longer processing information reliably. By then, rescue is a matter of reaching the person before their organs do what heat, at that level, eventually causes them to do. The water situation in the superstitions compounds all of this in specific and documented ways. The range is not entirely waterless, but it's close enough to waterless for most of the year that the distinction barely matters for someone who went in without enough to carry them through. Peralta Canyon has some seasonal pools. The higher elevations can hold snowmelt into early spring. But by late May, most of the reliable surface water in the lower and middle elevations is gone. Old topographic maps, some of which are still in circulation and still consulted by hikers, mark water sources that have not held water reliably for decades. A person planning a route based on an older map might budget their water supply around sources that will be bone dry when they arrive. 1 gallon of water per person per day is the standard recommendation for desert hiking in mild conditions. In the superstitions in summer, rangers and experienced desert hikers suggest significantly more, sometimes closer to 1 gallon per hour of active hiking in peak heat. Most people who go into the mountains underprepared are not carrying anything close to that. They are carrying what feels like a reasonable amount for a day hike, which in a more forgiving environment it would be, but which in the lower canyons of the superstitions in June or July is a margin that can evaporate quite literally before a person has gone far enough to turn back with confidence. The terrain itself adds another layer to this. The superstitions are formed primarily from welded tuff, a volcanic rock that is hard but deeply fractured. The surface material in many areas is loose and unstable, particularly on steeper slopes where the rock has broken down into gravel-sized fragments that shift underfoot. A step that looks solid can give way. A handhold on a cliff face can pull loose. The canyon walls are not uniform, and they are not all climbable down the way they look climbable from above. People who scramble down into a drainage to follow it toward water or toward a landmark they can see, below them sometimes find that the exit route they assumed was there is not, and that getting back up requires more than they have left. The crevices are a specific hazard that the case of Jesse Capen made impossible to ignore. Capen disappeared in December 2009, which was not summer, which means heat was not the primary factor in his death. He was found in November 2012, 3 years later, wedged in a narrow vertical crevice approximately 200 feet from a trail that search teams had walked multiple times. The crevice was not visible from the trail. It was not visible from the air. It was the kind of feature that the fractured volcanic terrain of the superstitions produces in abundance. A gap in the rock face wide enough for a person to fall into, but not wide enough for them to be seen from any practical angle. How Cap'n ended up in that crevice is not known with certainty. The most likely explanation is that he was scrambling on the rock face in low light or in a state of fatigue and fell into it. His body showed no signs of foul play. He was simply in a place where the terrain had taken him and where the terrain had kept him, hidden in plain sight, close enough to a trail that passing hikers might have been within a few dozen feet of him without knowing it. 3 years of searching, including multiple organised efforts by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, had not found him. The mountains had not given him back until the mountains decided to. Navigation in the Superstitions is harder than it looks on a map, and it looks complicated enough on a map. The ridgelines in the range run in multiple directions and intersect in ways that make orientation by visual reference genuinely difficult. From inside a canyon, the surrounding ridges can look nearly identical in form. The light changes the appearance of rock faces significantly across the day. A landmark that is clearly distinct at 8 in the morning when the sun is low and casting long shadows can look entirely different at noon under flat overhead light, and different again in the late afternoon when the colour of the rock shifts toward orange and the shadows fill in from the other side. Experienced desert hikers know this and compensate for it. People who have not spent significant time in the Sonoran Desert often do not. GPS devices help, but they are not a complete solution. Canyon walls can block satellite signals, particularly in the deeper, narrower drainages. Battery failure is a real concern, especially when heat accelerates battery drain and a person has been out longer than planned. Cell phone coverage in the Superstitions is unreliable in many areas. A person who goes in with a phone as their primary navigation tool and primary communication device is operating on assumptions that the terrain does not always support. The flash flood risk is less constant than the heat, but potentially more sudden in its consequences. The monsoon season in Arizona runs roughly from July through September, and the Superstitions sit directly in the path of the moisture flow that the monsoon brings up from the Gulf of Mexico. Thunderstorms can develop rapidly over the mountains, and the rain that falls in the higher elevations drains into the canyon system with very little absorption. The lower canyons, where many of the popular trails run, can go from dry to flooded in minutes. The floodwater carries debris, moves fast, and fills canyon floors that may be the only practical route through certain sections of terrain. A person caught in a narrow drainage during a flash flood has very limited options. The deaths of Ardian Charles and Malcolm Meeks in October 2010 are believed to have involved flood-related conditions, though the exact circumstances were never fully established. They went into the mountains together, which is better than going alone, but they went in without adequate preparation, and they did not come out. Their remains were found months later. The combination of exposure and the physical evidence at the scene suggested that water had played a role, though the canyon had had time to dry out long before they were found, and the full picture of what happened to them remains incomplete. The solo hiking pattern is one of the most consistent features of the Superstition disappearances. A significant proportion of the people who have died or gone missing in the range were alone when they went in. This is not unique to the Superstitions. Solo hiking is a risk factor in wilderness areas generally, but it's particularly significant here because of the specific way the terrain and heat interact with human judgment. A person hiking with a companion has a check on their decision-making, someone to say, "Actually, I think we should turn back." Someone to notice when the other person is moving strangely or making odd choices. Someone to stay with an injured hiker while the other goes for help. A solo hiker in the Superstitions in summer has none of those checks. When their judgment begins to degrade, there is nothing to catch it. And yet a meaningful number of the people who go into the Superstitions alone do so deliberately, not because they could not find a companion, but because they do not want one. The mind searchers in particular tend towards solitude. The treasure hunting culture around the lost Dutchman has always had a strong element of secrecy, of not wanting to share information or location with anyone who might claim a portion of the find. People have gone into those mountains alone because they believed they were close to something, and they did not want anyone else to be close to it with them. That instinct, which is understandable in the context of the mythology, has contributed to deaths in a direct and documented way. What all of this adds up to is a place where the margin for error is genuinely thin, and where several of the specific cultural and psychological factors surrounding the superstitions work to narrow that margin further rather than widen it. The heat degrades judgment. The terrain disorients. The water is not where people expect it to be. The crevices are invisible until you are in them. The floods arrive without warning. And the mythology pulls people farther in, keeps them out longer, and encourages the kind of solitary, secretive behaviour that removes the last safety checks. These are the practical explanations. They are real, they are documented, and for the majority of the deaths and disappearances in the superstitions, they are sufficient. They do not require anything beyond the physical facts of the landscape and the human body to account for what has happened there. A 66-year-old man alone in June, heat with inadequate water, does not need a supernatural explanation. Neither does a person who fell into a crevice at dusk while scrambling on fractured volcanic rock. But the practical explanations, as solid as they are, leave something unaddressed. They explain how people die in the superstitions. They do not fully explain why people keep going, why the search continues across generations, why the mythology around this particular mountain range has grown rather than faded as the body count has accumulated, why the community of searchers is, if anything, larger and more organised today than it was 50 years ago. The mechanics of death in the superstitions are largely understood. The mechanics of the obsession that drives people into those conditions are a different and more complicated question, and it is one that sits at the centre of what makes this place genuinely unusual. Because the superstitions do not just kill people through heat and terrain and bad luck. They kill people through a specific idea, through the persistent, powerful, deeply embedded belief that there is something extraordinary hidden in those canyons, and that the next trip might be the one that finds it. That belief is not geological. It is not meteorological. It is cultural and psychological, and it has proven, across more than a century of evidence, to be every bit as dangerous as the rocks and the sun. So let us talk about that belief. Let's talk about what it actually looks like, where it came from in its modern form, and why it has proven so extraordinarily resistant to the kind of evidence that would, in almost any other context, cause people to reconsider. The Lost Dutchman mine has been described by more than one historian and tourism writer as the most searched for treasure in American history. That is a difficult claim to verify precisely, but it is not obviously wrong. There are other famous American treasure legends: the Oak Island Money Pit, the Beale ciphers, the buried gold of the Confederacy, but none of them have produced the same sustained, organised, multi-generational search culture that the Dutchman has. None of them have their own annual festival. None of them have a state park named after the prospector at the centre of the story. None of them have generated quite the same density of competing theories, published maps, online communities, and people willing to walk into dangerous terrain in summer heat on the basis of a dying man's vague description from 1891. The Arizona Office of Tourism has estimated that tens of thousands of people visit the Superstition Mountains each year with the mine specifically in mind. The broader visitor count for the range is well over 200,000 annually, and while many of those people are simply hiking or camping, a meaningful fraction arrive carrying printed maps, downloaded theories, and a specific intention. They are not there to see the saguaros. They are there to find something that may not exist, in terrain that has killed people for trying. Apache Junction, the small city that sits at the western base of the range, has built a significant portion of its identity around the legend. Lost Dutchman State Park sits right at the edge of the mountains, named directly after Jacob Waltz. The Superstition Mountain Museum in Apache Junction has a permanent exhibition on the mine and the people who have searched for it. Every February, the town holds the Lost Dutchman Days Festival, a multi-day event with a parade, a rodeo, and various gold-themed activities that draws visitors from across the country. There are vendors selling treasure hunting supplies. There are talks by researchers presenting their latest theories about the mine's location. There is, in other words, an entire civic and commercial ecosystem that has grown up around the search, and that ecosystem has a strong interest in keeping the search alive. None of that is a criticism. It is simply a description of how thoroughly the legend has embedded itself into the identity of the place. The Dutchman's Trail, named directly after Waltz, is one of the most heavily used trails in the entire Tonto National Forest. It runs roughly 18 miles through the heart of the range, connecting several trailheads and passing through the terrain that is most associated with the mine search. On a busy weekend in spring before the heat becomes prohibitive, it is not unusual to encounter dozens of hikers on that trail, some of them there for the exercise and the views, and some of them pausing at rock formations and checking notes on their phones. The community of searchers is more organised than most outsiders would expect. There are active online forums where members share photographs of rock features, compare notes on geological surveys, debate the meaning of Waltz's deathbed descriptions, and post updates from recent trips. Some of these forums have been running for decades, accumulating thousands of posts. There are published books, some of them self-published, some through small regional presses, presenting competing theories about the mine's location. There are researchers who have spent years, sometimes decades, working the problem. Some of them have invested significant money in equipment, surveys and travel. A few have hired geologists. One or two have attempted aerial surveys of the range looking for anomalies in the terrain that might indicate old digging. The Peralta Trail, which gains about 1,300 feet in roughly 2.5 miles and ends at Fremont Saddle with a clear view of Weaver's Needle, has become something close to a pilgrimage route for serious searchers. Weaver's Needle is the most distinctive landmark in the range, a volcanic plug rising to about 4,553 feet, and it figures prominently in most serious theories about the mine's location. Waltz's deathbed descriptions, filtered through the retellings of Julia Thomas and later researchers, referenced a landmark that many people have interpreted as matching the needle. Standing at Fremont Saddle and looking at it for the first time has reportedly been a transformative experience for some searchers, a moment where the legend suddenly feels geographically real and locatable. That feeling, that sense of proximity, is part of what draws people farther into the terrain than is wise. What is interesting about the search culture and what makes it genuinely worth examining in the context of the disappearances is the specific way it interacts with risk. Ordinary hikers in the Superstitions tend to behave like ordinary hikers in any desert mountain range. They check the weather, carry water, tell someone where they're going, and turn back when the conditions get difficult. The search culture operates differently. It has its own internal logic, its own reward structure, and its own relationship to caution that can work directly against survival. Part of this is the secrecy element. The treasure hunting community around the Dutchman has always had a strong streak of competitive privacy. People do not share their best theories openly. They do not announce where they're going before they go. They do not bring companions who might later claim a share of the find, or perhaps more practically, who might tell other searchers where the first person was looking. The instinct to go alone and to go quietly is not incidental to the culture. It is close to central to it. And as we have already seen, going alone in the Superstitions is one of the most consistent predictors of a fatal outcome. There is also the phenomenon of escalating commitment. Researchers who study decision-making have a term for the tendency to continue investing in a course of action because of what has already been spent, even when the rational response would be to stop. In treasure hunting, this plays out in a very specific way. A person who has spent 5 years researching the mine, who has made a dozen trips into the mountains, who has invested money in equipment and maps and books, who has told friends and family that they are close to a discovery, is not psychologically positioned to walk away. Each trip that fails to find the mine is reinterpreted not as evidence that the mine does not exist, but as evidence that they were just slightly in the wrong place, that the next trip needs to go a little farther, a little deeper, a little closer to the terrain that is harder to reach. The sunk cost of the search becomes its own motivation, and that motivation pushes people into conditions they would otherwise avoid. Jesse Capon is perhaps the clearest example of this pattern. He was 35 years old from Denver, Colorado, and by the time he disappeared in December 2009, he had made multiple trips to the Superstitions over several years. His apartment, when investigators later searched it, was reportedly covered in maps and notes about the mine. He had done serious research. He was not a casual visitor. He was a committed searcher who had invested a significant portion of his adult life in the project. On the trip from which he did not return, he went alone, as he typically did, and he went into terrain that was more difficult and more remote than the popular trails. He was found 3 years later, in November 2012, wedged in a narrow crevice approximately 200 feet from a trail. He had apparently fallen or climbed into the crevice and had been unable to get out. The location was not far from areas that search teams had covered. The crevice was simply not visible from the surface in a way that made it easy to check. He had been there, essentially in plain sight of the search area, for 3 years. The case illustrates something important about the mine search specifically. Cappen's commitment to finding the mine had taken him off the marked trails and into the fractured volcanic terrain, where the crevices are most numerous and most dangerous. A hiker with no particular goal beyond the walk would have had no reason to be where he was. The mine search put him there. The mine search, or more precisely the psychological state the mine search produces, is what moved him from the relative safety of the trail system into the terrain where he died. Curtis Merworth disappeared in May 2010, also while searching for the mine. He has never been found. The Superstitions are approximately 160,000 acres, which sounds large but is not enormous by wilderness standards. Search teams covered significant portions of the range after his disappearance and found nothing. The volcanic tough terrain, with its crevices and overhangs and fractured rock faces, is capable of concealing a person completely. The mountains are not vast. They are simply very good at keeping what they take. There are people who have returned to the Superstitions repeatedly after close calls, after getting lost, after running out of water, after being rescued. The search culture treats these experiences not as warnings, but as evidence of progress, as proof that the searcher is getting closer to the right area, as data points to incorporate into the next attempt. This is not irrational within the internal logic of the search. If you believe the mine exists and that you are methodically narrowing down its location, then a difficult trip that nearly went wrong is still a trip that produced information. The problem is that the terrain does not grade on effort or commitment. It does not reward persistence with safety. The person who has been into the mountains 15 times and survived is not necessarily safer on the 16th trip. In some ways, they may be less safe, because experience builds confidence, and confidence in the Superstitions has a way of exceeding what the terrain actually warrants. The annual Lost Dutchman Days Festival in Apache Junction is, in its way, a remarkable thing to think about in this context. It is a celebration of a search that has cost multiple lives, that continues to put people in danger, and that has never produced the thing it is searching for. And yet it is genuinely popular, genuinely festive, and attended by people who are, for the most part, perfectly reasonable. They are not reckless, they are enthusiastic. The legend of the Dutchman has become something larger than a treasure hunt. It has become a community, an identity, a shared project that gives people a sense of purpose and belonging and connection to something historical and mythological and just barely possible. The mine, real or not, has become a reason to gather, to share theories, to feel part of a story that is still unfolding. That is not nothing. That is in fact quite a lot. But the community also generates the conditions for the disappearances. It sustains the belief that the mine is findable. It provides a social environment in which going into the mountains alone and in secret is normalized and even admired. It rewards commitment and persistence in ways that make pulling back feel like failure. It keeps the pipeline of searchers flowing into terrain that has been demonstrably dangerous for over a century. Some of the more organized searchers in the community are genuinely careful. They use modern equipment. They go in pairs or groups. They file trip plans. They carry satellite communicators. The search has become more professionalised in some quarters, and those searchers are doing something closer to responsible wilderness exploration. But the culture also attracts people who are less organised, less experienced, and more driven by the emotional pull of the legend than by any systematic methodology. And the mountains do not distinguish between them. What the Lost Dutchman mind search has created, across more than a century of accumulated mythology and community and obsession, is a sustained human pressure on a specific dangerous landscape. It has produced, generation after generation, a supply of people willing to go farther into that landscape than ordinary recreation would take them. Willing to go alone, willing to go in conditions they should not, willing to stay longer than they should, because they believe, genuinely and sometimes desperately believe, that they are close to something extraordinary. That belief is the specific mechanism by which the mythology of the superstitions translates into deaths, not through the supernatural, through the very human tendency to let a powerful story override the quieter signals that say turn back, drink water, stay on the trail, tell someone where you're going. And then there are the claims that sit outside all of this. The ones that the search community whispers about, that show up in forum posts alongside the geological surveys and the competing map theories that suggest the mountains may be doing something to people that goes beyond heat and terrain and obsession. Those claims are stranger, harder to evaluate, and in some ways more interesting for what they reveal about the psychology of the place. Because even the people who do not believe them find themselves, at a certain point deep in the superstitions, understanding why someone might. The strangest claims about the superstitions tend to cluster around a few specific locations. Weaver's Needle is one of them. The volcanic plug rises sharply above the surrounding terrain, visible from miles away, and there is something about its shape, isolated, vertical, almost deliberate, that invites a certain kind of attention. People have been reporting unusual sightings near Weaver's Needle for decades, UFO reports mostly. Lights moving in patterns that do not match aircraft, hovering objects that disappear without sound. These accounts go back at least to the 1950s and continue to appear in hiking forums and local reports today. Most of them are probably explainable. Aircraft from nearby military corridors, atmospheric light effects, the way the desert air bends and distorts at certain temperatures. The Phoenix area is one of the busiest airspaces in the country, and the superstitions sit close enough to several military training routes that unusual aircraft are not uncommon in the region. Luke Air Force Base is roughly 60 miles to the west. Barry M. Goldwater Range is to the south. The skies above Arizona carry things that look strange to people who are not familiar with military aviation. But the reports persist, and some of them are detailed enough that the people making them clearly believe they saw something that does not fit the ordinary categories. One account from a hiker in 2007, posted on a backcountry forum and later referenced in several articles about the mountains, described a large triangular object moving slowly above the ridgeline east of Weaver's Needle, making no sound and then simply stopping before moving backward and disappearing. The person who wrote it was specific about the time, early evening around 7:30, and about the conditions, clear sky, no wind, full visibility. Whether the account is accurate is impossible to verify. What is interesting is that it fits a pattern of reports from that specific area going back several decades, and that the person writing it seemed genuinely unsettled rather than excited. They were not trying to build a story, they were trying to make sense of something. The underground base theory is a different kind of claim, and it circulates more specifically within the treasure hunting community than in the general hiking world. The idea, in its various forms, suggests that a government installation of some kind exists beneath the superstitions, that tunnels or chambers have been constructed in the volcanic rock, that the disappearances are connected to surveillance or retrieval operations, that certain areas of the range are actively monitored and controlled. This theory has no credible documentation behind it. There is no evidence of any classified installation in the superstitions, No whistleblower accounts with verifiable detail. No geological survey data suggesting large-scale subsurface construction. It is almost certainly folklore, the kind of explanation that forms naturally in communities when official answers feel insufficient. When people disappear and no bodies found and no explanation is offered, the mind reaches for a framework that preserves the possibility of meaning. A government conspiracy, however implausible, at least implies that someone knows what happened. That is psychologically more comfortable than the alternative, which is that the terrain simply swallowed someone and kept them. What is more interesting and more grounded is the compass anomaly. This one has a real explanation, at least partially. Hikers in the Superstitions have reported compass readings that seem unreliable, needles that drift or point in directions that do not match known landmarks, readings that are inconsistent from one spot to another. The geological basis for this is straightforward. The volcanic tuff that makes up much of the range contains significant deposits of magnetite, a naturally occurring iron oxide mineral that is strongly magnetic. Magnetite deposits can create local magnetic anomalies that affect compass readings. The effect is not uniform across the range. It depends on where exactly you are and how concentrated the deposits are in that area, but it is real, and it has been documented. The Superstitions are not unique in this regard. Volcanic terrain in many parts of the world produces similar anomalies, but the combination of this effect with the already disorienting visual character of the ridgelines creates a specific problem. A hiker who's relying on a compass to navigate terrain that already looks confusing may find that both of their primary navigation tools are giving them contradictory information at the same moment. This does not require any supernatural explanation. It is geology doing what geology does. But in a place already saturated with mythology, an experience like a compass spinning unexpectedly takes on a different weight. It becomes evidence of something. It becomes part of the story a person tells themselves about why this place is different, why it resists ordinary navigation, why people who come here do not always come back. The experience is real. The mechanism is mundane, but the interpretation is shaped entirely by the context in which it occurs. The vortex claims are a step further out. Some visitors to the Superstitions describe the mountains as having energy vortexes, concentrated points of unusual electromagnetic or spiritual energy, similar to the claims made about Sedona, about 2 hours to the north. Sedona's vortex reputation is well established as a cultural phenomenon, drawing tens of thousands of visitors annually who report feelings of heightened awareness, emotional intensity, and physical sensation at specific sites. The scientific consensus on Sedona's vortexes is essentially that there is no measurable physical phenomenon producing these effects. The experiences are real to the people having them, but they appear to be products of expectation, environment, and the particular way the human mind responds to dramatic landscape. The red rock formations of Sedona are visually striking in a way that produces a kind of awe response. And awe is a powerful psychological state that can feel like something external even when it is entirely internal. The Superstitions produce something similar. The landscape is genuinely dramatic. The sudden cliff faces, the depth of the canyon shadows, the way the rock changes colour through the day from pale gold to deep orange to something almost purple in the last light before dark. The silence in the inner canyons is a specific kind of silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but the presence of a sound environment that is unfamiliar to most visitors. Wind moving through volcanic rock, the occasional distant call of a canyon wren, the sound of your own footsteps on loose tuff. People who spend time in this environment, especially alone, often describe a heightened perceptual state that feels like the landscape is doing something to them. It probably is, in a neurological sense. Isolation, physical exertion, heat, unusual visual stimuli, and a culturally primed expectation of strangeness are a powerful combination. The brain in that state is not unreliable exactly, but it is operating differently than it does in familiar environments. It is more alert, more pattern-seeking, more likely to assign significance to ambiguous sensory input. The Guardian theory is the one that feels most specific to the superstitions, most rooted in the particular culture of the mine search. In various forms, it suggests that the mine is protected, not by geology or terrain, but by something intentional. Some versions of this are explicitly supernatural, a spirit or entity associated with the mountains that punishes those who come too close to the mine. This connects loosely to the Apache thunder god tradition, though treasure hunters have adapted it in ways that the original tradition would probably not recognize. Other versions are more pragmatic. The idea that someone, some family or group, knows where the mine is and actively works to prevent others from finding it, that the disappearances are not accidents but interventions. There have been persistent rumours circulating in the treasure hunting community for decades, of a family of reclusive guardians living somewhere in the range, of warnings left on cairns, of equipment being moved or damaged. None of this has ever been substantiated with verifiable evidence. But the rumours have influenced behaviour. Some searchers have gone into the mountains with a sense of being watched that goes beyond ordinary wilderness awareness, a belief that their presence was known and unwelcome. What is worth noting about all of these fringe claims is not whether they are true. Most of them almost certainly are not, at least not in the literal forms they take, but what they reveal about how the mountains affect people. Every one of these theories is an attempt to impose a framework of intention on a landscape that does not have one. The compass anomaly becomes evidence of energy. The disorientation becomes evidence of a vortex. The disappearances become evidence of a guardian. The lights in the sky become evidence of surveillance. What all of these interpretations share is the assumption that the mountains are doing something purposeful, that there is a will behind the strangeness, that the place is not simply difficult but is in some sense aware. This is not a crazy response to the superstitions. It is in fact a very human one. The mountains are old in a way that feels personal. The volcanic rock has a texture and a colour that suggests solidity and age in the same way an old building does. Something that has been here far longer than you and will be here long after. The canyon walls close in around you in a way that feels deliberate. The silence is specific. The heat is pressing. When the terrain defeats your navigation and your compass drifts and the ridgelines all look the same and the shadows shift and you realise you have been walking for 2 hours without recognising anything, the experience is not abstract. It is physical and immediate and slightly frightening. In that state, the mind reaches for explanation, and the superstitions have been providing explanations in the form of legend and rumour and accumulated testimony for over a century. The accounts of strange disorientation, beyond what the terrain alone would seem to explain, are the ones that sit most uncomfortably in the middle. Not the UFO reports, which are easy to set aside, and not the Guardian theory, which is clearly folkloric, but the specific accounts of experienced hikers who describe losing their sense of direction in conditions where they should not have, of feeling suddenly and completely uncertain about where they were in a canyon they had been through before, of a quality of confusion that came on quickly and lifted slowly. These accounts come from people who are not treasure hunters, not mythology enthusiasts, not particularly given to unusual claims. They come from experienced outdoors people who are reporting something that happened to them and that they do not fully understand. The partial geological explanation, magnetite deposits, compass drift, similar-looking ridgelines in volcanic tuff, is real and accounts for some of this. The heat explanation accounts for more. At temperatures above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, cognitive function degrades in ways that can feel sudden and severe to the person experiencing it. The early stages of heat exhaustion include confusion, difficulty concentrating, and a specific kind of spatial disorientation that can make familiar terrain feel strange. If a person is already slightly dehydrated and has been hiking for several hours in full sun, the mental clarity they feel at the trailhead is not the mental clarity they have 3 hours in. They may not recognise this. People in the early stages of heat illness often feel fine. They feel, if anything, slightly euphoric, a physiological effect of the early stages of heat stress. The confusion arrives later, and by then the decisions that led to it have already been made. So the strange disorientation that experienced hikers describe may be, in many cases, the early stages of heat illness presenting in a landscape that is already visually confusing. The magnetite adds a layer, the isolation adds a layer, the mythology adds a layer, and the result is an experience that feels genuinely uncanny, that feels like the place is doing something, when what is actually happening is that the place is doing exactly what it has always done, and the person inside it is simply encountering the full weight of it. None of this means the fringe claims are entirely without interest. Even the claims that are almost certainly false tell us something real about how this landscape operates on the human mind. They tell us that the superstitions produce experiences that feel like they require extraordinary explanation, that the ordinary explanations feel insufficient to people who have been inside the mountains, that there is something about the specific combination of geology and heat and isolation and mythology that pushes people toward the edges of their interpretive frameworks. That is genuinely significant. Not because it suggests the mountains are supernatural, but because it suggests the mountains are doing something to human psychology that is consistent, documented, and not entirely accounted for by the practical explanations alone. And that psychological dimension is where the story gets most interesting, because the question of why people keep going missing in the superstitions is not only a question about terrain and temperature and navigation, it is a question about how human beings behave in places that have been assigned a particular kind of meaning, about how mythology and physical environment interact to produce decisions that lead people into situations they cannot get out of. The fringe claims are the most visible expression of that psychological pressure, but the pressure itself runs much deeper than the claims, and understanding it is the closest thing we have to understanding why the superstitions keep doing what they do. So let us stay with that psychological dimension for a moment, because it is where the real explanation lives, and it is more interesting than any of the fringe theories that orbit the superstitions. There is a concept in environmental psychology called place attachment, which refers to the emotional and cognitive bonds that form between people and specific landscapes. It sounds academic, and it is, but the practical meaning is simple enough. Certain places change how we think and behave in ways that go beyond the physical. We make different decisions in places that carry meaning for us. We take risks we would not otherwise take. We stay longer than we should. We ignore signals that we would catch in a neutral environment. The superstitions are one of the most extreme examples of this phenomenon in the American West, possibly in the world, because the mythology layered onto them over the past century and a half has made them into a place that carries enormous psychological weight before a person even sets foot on a trail. People arrive already changed. They arrive with the story running in the background, with the weight of the legend pressing on their decisions, with a particular kind of attention that is not the same as the attention of a person who simply wants a good hike. This matters in a very direct way. When a person hikes in a place they regard as neutral terrain, they are calibrating constantly against reality. They notice when they are tired. They notice when the water is running low. They notice when the light is changing and the temperature is dropping, and it is time to turn around. These are small, ordinary calculations that experienced hikers make almost automatically. But when a person is hiking in a place they regard as significant, as potentially transformative, as possibly the day they find something that has not been found in 130 years, those calculations get disrupted. The attention is directed outward, toward rock formations that might be landmarks, toward canyon walls that might match a description, toward the terrain as a text to be decoded rather than as an environment to be managed. The internal signals get quieter. The water bottle gets lighter without anyone noticing. The light changes and the person keeps going because they are close, or they feel close, or they want to be close. This is not stupidity. It is not even carelessness in the ordinary sense. It is something more specific, a redirection of cognitive resources driven by a particular kind of hope. and the superstitions have been generating that hope in people for generations. Research on heat and cognitive function adds another layer to this that is worth understanding clearly. The human brain begins to show measurable impairment in decision-making at core body temperatures above about 99 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not a high threshold. On a day when the air temperature in the lower canyons is 110 degrees and a person has been hiking for 2 hours with insufficient water, their core temperature may already be approaching that range. The impairment is subtle at first. It does not feel like confusion. It feels like certainty. Studies on heat stress consistently show that one of the early cognitive effects is a reduction in the ability to recognize one's own impairment, which is a particularly cruel feature of the condition. People in the early stages of heat exhaustion often report feeling fine, feeling determined, feeling focused. The doubt that would normally prompt them to reconsider does not arrive. It has been quietly switched off by the same process that is already degrading their judgment. At higher temperatures and more advanced dehydration, the effects become more dramatic. Spatial reasoning degrades significantly, which means that the ability to read terrain, to match what is in front of you to what is on a map, to remember where you turned and in which direction, all of this becomes unreliable. A canyon that a person walked through clearly 2 hours ago may genuinely look different to them now, not because the canyon has changed, but because the cognitive machinery used to process and remember spatial information is running on reduced capacity. The ridgelines that look similar in the best of conditions look identical now. The landmarks that seem distinct in the morning are indistinguishable from each other in the afternoon. The person is lost, but they do not feel lost in the way we imagine being lost. They feel like the terrain is simply not cooperating, like the landscape is being difficult, like the place is doing something to them, and in a sense it is. It is doing exactly what it does to everyone who enters it underprepared. It is being the Sonoran Desert in summer. The specific psychological profile of people who go missing in the superstitions is worth looking at carefully, because it is not random. Search and rescue records and the documented cases from over the years reveal a pattern that is consistent enough to be meaningful. The majority of people who disappear or die in the mountains are male. Most of them are solo. Many of them have some experience in the outdoors, enough to feel confident, enough to have made similar trips before without incident. They are not beginners who did not know what they were getting into. They are people who thought they knew what they were getting into and were wrong in ways they did not anticipate. The experience factor is particularly important. A true beginner, faced with the superstitions in summer, might turn back early simply because everything feels difficult and unfamiliar. An experienced hiker, someone who has done desert hiking before, who has managed heat and navigation and long distances, may push further precisely because their experience tells them they can handle it. And they may be right about their general capability while being wrong about this specific situation, on this specific day, in this specific heat, with this specific level of preparation. Confidence built on previous success does not always transfer cleanly to new conditions, and the superstitions are expert at presenting conditions that look familiar until they are not. The solo factor compounds everything. When two people are hiking together, there is a built-in check on each person's judgment. One person's doubt can surface and be heard. One person can notice that the other is not drinking enough, is moving more slowly, is making decisions that seem off. Two people together are more likely to turn back, more likely to call for help, more likely to recognize a situation before it becomes critical. Alone, a person has only their own judgment, and if that judgment is being quietly eroded by heat and dehydration and the particular psychology of the superstitions, there is nothing to catch it. Jesse Capen is the case that illustrates this most clearly. He was 35 years old from Denver, and by most accounts he was not an inexperienced person. He had made multiple trips to the superstition specifically to search for the lost Dutchman mine. He had done research, he had maps, he had a framework for what he was looking for, He disappeared in December 2009, which is worth noting because December is not the dangerous season in terms of heat. The temperatures in winter are manageable, sometimes cold. So the heat explanation, which accounts for so many of the summer disappearances, does not apply to Kappen in the same way. What applies to Kappen is the terrain, the isolation, and the particular quality of attention that the mind search produces. He was found in November 2012, 3 years after he disappeared, wedged in a narrow crevice approximately 200 feet from a trail. 200 feet. The search teams had walked past that spot, or near it, multiple times. The terrain had simply hidden him completely, in a space so narrow and so unremarkable from the outside that it was invisible to people who were looking. What happened to Kappen in those final moments is not fully known. The most likely explanation is that he was exploring difficult terrain in pursuit of something he believed was close, that he lost his footing or misjudged a descent, and that the crevice took him in a way that left no visible sign. It is a death that is entirely explained by the terrain and the psychology of the search, and it is also a death that feels, in some way, that is hard to articulate, like the mountains doing what they do, not with intention, not with awareness, but with the same indifferent consistency that has been taking people for over a century. There is something else worth naming here, which is the specific quality of isolation that the superstitions produce despite being 40 miles from a major city. Phoenix is visible from the western edges of the range on a clear day. The lights of Apache Junction are visible at night from certain ridgelines. The mountains are not remote in the way that, say, the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana is remote. They're adjacent to suburban sprawl. There are trailheads with parking lots. There are trail signs. There are other hikers. And yet, once a person is 2 or 3 miles into the canyon system, the city disappears entirely. The canyon walls rise and close the sky into a narrow strip. The sound of traffic is gone. The trails diverge and the other hikers thin out, and suddenly, the only thing in any direction is rock and heat, and the specific silence of a place that is not interested in your presence. This transition from accessible to genuinely isolated happens faster in the superstitions than in many wilderness areas, and it catches people off guard. They arrive at the trailhead with the psychological confidence of someone who is close to civilization, who could turn around and be at a gas station in 40 minutes, and they carry that confidence into terrain that does not honour it. The canyon does not know that the parking lot is 3 miles back. The heat does not adjust for the proximity of air conditioning. The ridgelines do not become easier to read because Phoenix is visible on the horizon. The mountains are indifferent to their own accessibility, and that indifference is part of what makes them dangerous in a way that is specific to them. And all of this, the heat, the terrain, the navigation, the isolation, the psychology of the mind search, the particular quality of attention that the legend produces, all of it operates together in a way that is more than the sum of its parts. The mythology of the superstitions is not just a cultural curiosity layered on top of a dangerous landscape. It is an active ingredient in the danger. It changes how people behave in the mountains in ways that make them more vulnerable to exactly the conditions that kill people there. It directs attention away from the body and toward the terrain as a puzzle. It extends trips beyond safe limits because the person believes they are close. It draws people back again and again to a place that has already shown them it is difficult, because the legend tells them that persistence is the key, and that the mine rewards those who keep looking. The superstitions are, in this sense, a place where a story has become part of the physical danger, not in any supernatural way, but in the very practical way that human beings are storytelling animals who make decisions based on the narratives they are living inside, and the narrative of the Lost Dutchman mine is one that has been optimized over generations of retelling to produce exactly the kind of behavior that gets people into trouble in these specific mountains. None of this is the fault of the mountains. They have not done anything. They are volcanic rock and desert heat and narrow canyons and a population of saguaro cacti that are entirely unbothered by the whole situation. But the mountains and the story have been wound together for so long that separating them is no longer really possible. The story is part of what the mountains are now, part of what draws people to them, part of what happens inside people's heads when they are standing at Fremont Saddle looking at Weaver's Needle for the first time and feeling the particular pull of a place that has been promised to them in 100 different accounts. And the people who know these mountains best, the rangers, the search and rescue teams, the locals who have watched this pattern repeat for decades, have their own way of talking about all of this, their own understanding of what the place does to people and why the rescues keep coming. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office has a search and rescue unit that knows these mountains in a way that most people never will. They have walked the Peralta Trail in June heat. They have descended into canyon drainages that do not appear on standard trail maps. They have searched the same ridgeline twice in a single day and found different things each time, or found nothing at all. And the volume of work the superstitions generate for them is, by any reasonable measure, disproportionate to the size of the range. The mountains cover roughly 160,000 acres. That is not a small area, but it is not enormous either, not compared to the millions of acres of wilderness that exist elsewhere in Arizona alone. And yet in some years, the superstitions account for a striking share of the backcountry rescue calls that come into Maricopa County. The specific numbers vary year to year, but rangers and SAR coordinators have described the range in public statements and interviews as one of the most consistently demanding rescue environments in the state. Not because it is the most remote, or the highest, or the most technically difficult, but because of the particular combination of accessibility, extreme conditions, and the specific kind of person the mountains attract. The rescue operations themselves are not simple. Helicopter access, which is often the fastest and safest way to extract an injured or incapacitated hiker, is significantly limited by the terrain. The canyon walls in many parts of the range are too narrow and too steep for a helicopter to descend safely. Wind patterns in the canyons can be unpredictable, particularly during monsoon season. There are sections of the superstitions where a helicopter can hover above a canyon and see someone on the ground and still be unable to reach them directly. The crew has to either find a landing zone at some distance and send a ground team in, or attempt a hoist extraction, which requires the right equipment, the right conditions, and enough clear space above the person to operate safely. None of those things are guaranteed in the superstitions. Ground teams face their own version of the same problems that got the missing person into trouble in the first place. The ridgelines look alike. The canyons branch and dead end. Heat affects the searchers as surely as it affected the person they are looking for, which means rest stops, hydration schedules, and time limits become part of the operational planning. A search team cannot simply walk until they find someone. They have to manage their own safety while managing the search, and in extreme summer heat, those two demands can come into direct conflict. There is a particular kind of frustration, described by people who have done this work, that comes from searching a small area thoroughly and finding nothing. The superstitions are not vast enough that a person could simply vanish into unlimited wilderness. The geometry of the range should, in theory, make searches more tractable. And yet the terrain is so fractured, so full of crevices and overhangs and narrow slots and loose boulder fields that a person can be invisible at close range. Jesse Cappan was found approximately 200 feet from a trail. Search teams had covered that ground. They had been, in all likelihood, within shouting distance of where he lay. The crevice that held him was narrow enough that it was not visible as a significant feature from the trail. It did not look from the outside like a place where a person could fit, and so it was not searched, not thoroughly, not in the way a more obvious feature would have been, until the third year, when someone finally looked in the right place at the right angle. That case stayed with the people involved in the search. It is the kind of outcome that is technically explicable, that has a clear physical cause, and that still manages to feel wrong in a way that is hard to shake. Because the gap between where Cappan was and where people were looking for him was so small. Not miles, not an unreachable wilderness, 200 feet, a distance you could cover in a minute of walking, and the mountains held him for 3 years. The SAR teams have developed protocols specifically adapted to the superstitions over the years. Searches are conducted in the early morning when possible, before the heat of the day makes extended ground operations dangerous. Certain canyon areas are flagged as high-priority search zones based on historical patterns of where people have been found. Teams are briefed on the specific navigation challenges of the range, the way the ridgelines repeat themselves, the way the light changes the apparent shape of the terrain at different times of day. There is institutional knowledge built up over decades of rescues, and that knowledge is specific to this place in ways that would not transfer directly to another mountain range. Rangers at the Tonto National Forest have also worked on the prevention side of this, with varying degrees of success. Signage at the major trailheads has been improved over the years. The warnings are explicit. Carry 1 gallon of water per person per day in summer. Tell someone where you're going and when you expect to return. Do not hike alone. Turn around if you feel any symptoms of heat illness. Emergency water caches were installed at certain points along the most heavily used trails after the cluster of deaths in 2009 and 2010. These are not large caches, but they represent an acknowledgement that people will arrive underprepared, and that having water available at a critical point might be the difference between a close call and a fatality. The response to that cluster of deaths was fairly significant in terms of official attention. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office issued formal public warnings. Local news coverage was substantial. Arizona officials spoke publicly about the dangers of the range in a way that was more direct than the usual seasonal hiking safety reminders. And for a period, there was genuine discussion about whether additional restrictions or requirements, mandatory registration, permit systems, gear checks, something, should be implemented for the more remote areas of the superstitions. Nothing that formal was ultimately put in place. The superstitions remain open, largely unrestricted, accessible to anyone who wants to walk in, which is in many ways the right call for a public wilderness area, but it does mean that the prevention work relies almost entirely on education and on hikers making good decisions before they arrive. And education, as anyone who has worked in outdoor safety knows, is imperfect. People read the warning signs at the trailhead and feel them directed at someone else. Someone less experienced, someone less prepared, someone who does not know what they're doing. The person reading the sign, the person who has done this before, the person who is sure they have enough water, the person who is certain they will recognize the landmarks, that person tends to keep walking. Curtis Merworth disappeared in May 2010. He was an experienced outdoorsman. He had hiked in the superstitions before. He went in with a specific purpose, searching for the mine, and he did not come back out. Searches conducted at the time found nothing. Subsequent searches have found nothing. He is still listed as missing. The terrain has not given him back the way it eventually gave back Jesse Capon. Whether that means his remains are in a location that has not been searched, or in a location that has been searched without recognition, or somewhere that the terrain has genuinely concealed without obvious explanation, is not known. He is simply gone, in a range that is 40 miles from a major American city, in a state with active search and rescue infrastructure, in a modern era with GPS and satellite communication and aerial search capability. Gone. There is something that the people who do this work come back to, something that gets said in various forms when rangers or SAR coordinators talk about the superstitions publicly. It is not a supernatural claim. It is not a concession to mystery for the sake of drama. It is something more like a practical observation about the nature of the terrain. The mountains are better at hiding things than they should be. Not because of anything unusual, not because of any force that resists search efforts, but because the specific geology of the range, the fractured volcanic tuff, the narrow crevices, the boulder fields, the way canyon walls create shadows and false floors, produces a landscape that is genuinely difficult to search completely. You can walk through an area and miss things that are right in front of you, not because you are careless, but because the terrain is structured in a way that makes certain features invisible from certain angles. This is a practical reality that the SAR teams have to account for in their operations. It means that a negative search result, we searched that area and found nothing, does not carry the same weight in the superstitions that it might in a more open landscape. It means that searches have to be conducted multiple times, from multiple angles, in multiple light conditions, before the absence of a person in a given area can be stated with confidence. And it means that the gap between a person being somewhere and a search team finding them can be measured not just in distance, but in geometry, in the specific angles and shadows and fractures of a landscape that does not present itself the same way twice. The rangers who have worked the superstitions for years develop a specific kind of relationship with the range. Not reverence exactly, though some of them would probably not object to that word. More like a careful respect for the fact that the mountains operate on their own terms, that they do not become easier to understand simply because you have spent more time in them, and that the appropriate response to that is not fear, but attention. Sustained, careful, humble attention. The kind of attention that keeps you from walking past a narrow crevice without looking into it. The kind of attention that makes you check your water before you think you need to, turn around before you feel ready to, and tell someone your exact route before you leave the trailhead. There is one other thing worth noting about the SAR dimension of the superstitions, which is the role of the volunteer community. The mountains have attracted not just treasure hunters, but a broader community of people who care about them, who know the terrain well, and who contribute to search efforts when people go missing. Some of these are experienced hikers who have spent years in the range. Some are former treasure hunters who know specific areas in unusual detail. The relationship between the official SAR infrastructure and this informal community of knowledgeable volunteers is something that has evolved over the years, and in specific searches it has been genuinely useful. People who know where the crevices are, who have explored the less travelled drainages, who can look at a map and say, based on what they know of the terrain, here is where I would look first. That kind of local knowledge is not something that can be replicated quickly by an outside team. But even with all of this, with the institutional knowledge, the improved signage, the emergency water caches, the helicopter capability, the volunteer community, the formal warnings, the decades of accumulated experience, the rescues keep coming. Not every season, not at a constant rate, but consistently enough that the pattern is clear. The superstitions are a place where people get into serious trouble on a regular basis, and where the trouble is sometimes fatal, and where the bodies are sometimes not found for years or not found at all. And the reasons for this are practical, documented, and well understood by the people who manage the range. But the reasons being understood has not made the problem go away. Which brings up something that even the most practically minded people involved in this story find themselves circling back to. A question that does not have a clean answer. The superstitions are not the most dangerous wilderness area in Arizona. They are not the hottest, not the most remote, not the most technically demanding. There are places in the state where the conditions are more extreme and the infrastructure is thinner, and yet the superstitions produce a specific, persistent, and somewhat disproportionate pattern of serious incidents. The practical explanations account for a great deal of it, but the question of why this particular place, with this particular combination of characteristics, has been taking people for over a century in a pattern that has not meaningfully changed despite everything that has been learned and implemented, that question sits at the edge of what the practical explanations can fully reach. Part of the answer, of course, lies in the geography of the mine search, and in the specific landmark that has been at the centre of the obsession for as long as anyone can remember. That landmark is Weaver's Needle. If you have ever seen a photograph of the Superstition Mountains and found yourself staring at one particular feature, a tall, narrow spike of rock rising above the surrounding ridgelines, like something left behind after the rest of the landscape wore away, that is Weaver's Needle. It stands at roughly 4,553 feet, a volcanic plug, which means it is the solidified core of an ancient vent. The the soft outer material having eroded away over millions of years to leave this harder interior column standing alone. It is visible from a remarkable number of points within the range, and from the valley below, on clear days, it reads almost like a marker, like something placed deliberately to be seen from a distance. Whether or not that quality was intentional by any human hand, it has functioned that way for a very long time. The needle is named for Paulino Weaver, a fur trapper and scout who worked the Arizona Territory in the mid-1800s, and who by most accounts was one of the more capable wilderness travellers of his era. His name ended up attached to this feature in the way that names often attach to landmarks in the American West, somewhat arbitrarily, through a combination of proximity, reputation, and the tendency of cartographers to fill blank spaces with whoever happened to be nearby. Weaver himself does not appear to have had any particular connection to the lost Dutchman legend, but the needle that bears his name became the centre of it. The connection to Jacob Waltz comes through the deathbed accounts. When Waltz reportedly described the location of his mine to his neighbour Julia Thomas in 1891, the descriptions he gave, or the descriptions that were later attributed to him and written down and passed along and embellished and simplified across decades of retelling, referenced a prominent rock formation that could be seen from the mine. Something tall, something distinctive, something that would be hard to miss. The identification of that formation as Weaver's Needle was made by later searchers, not by Waltz himself in any documented way, but it became accepted as near certain within the treasure hunting community, and that acceptance has been durable. For well over 100 years, the area around Weaver's Needle has been the primary focus of the search. The physical approach to the needle from the most common direction runs along the Peralta Trail, which begins at the Peralta Trailhead on the western edge of the range and gains about 1,300 feet of elevation over roughly 2.5 miles. It is not a technically difficult trail by the standards of serious mountaineering, but it is steep, exposed, and unforgiving in heat. The upper section passes through Peralta Canyon, a narrow drainage flanked by high walls of welded tuff, and then climbs to Fremont Saddle, which sits at around 3,770 feet. The saddle is where most hikers get their first unobstructed view of Weaver's Needle, standing roughly 1.5 miles to the northeast, framed by the canyon walls behind you and the open terrain ahead. It is genuinely a striking view. The needle rises sharply above the surrounding terrain, its profile clean and distinctive against whatever the sky is doing that day. In morning light it catches a warm tone that makes the rock look almost orange. In afternoon shadow it goes grey and severe. On days when cloud cover is moving through, it can look entirely different from hour to hour. People who have stood at Fremont Saddle and seen it for the first time often describe something close to a physical response, a kind of recognition, as though the landscape suddenly made sense in a way it had not before. That response is probably partly aesthetic and partly the effect of arriving somewhere you have heard about for a long time. But it is real, and it matters, because it is at Fremont Saddle that a significant number of searchers have made decisions they should not have made. The terrain between the saddle and the needle is considerably more difficult than the trail that leads to the saddle. There is no maintained path. The ground drops into drainages and climbs again across boulder fields and loose rock. The canyons between here and the needle are narrow and poorly mapped in places, and the visual clarity that makes the needle look close from the saddle is deceptive. Distance in this kind of terrain does not behave the way it looks. A feature that appears to be 40 minutes away might be 2 hours away, once you account for the actual ground between you and it. Rangers and experienced hikers who know the range well have noted this specifically about the Fremont Saddle view. It creates an impression of accessibility that the terrain does not support. You can see the needle. You feel like you could walk to it. The walk is much harder than it looks. This is where the geology becomes relevant in a more than abstract way. The rock around Weaver's Needle is not uniform. The volcanic tuff that makes up most of the range is fractured here, in ways that create unexpected drops, hidden crevices, and surfaces that look stable but are not. Some areas have significant loose material on top of harder rock, what geologists sometimes call colluvium, which shifts underfoot and can give way on slopes. The canyons on the north and east sides of the Needle in particular are the kind of terrain that rewards very slow, careful movement and punishes haste or overconfidence. The same fractured geology that makes this area so difficult to search in a rescue context makes it difficult to navigate safely when you're trying to move through it quickly, or in fading light, or without enough water. There is also the matter of what the geology actually says about gold in this area. This is worth spending a moment on, because it is one of the things that keeps the mine story alive in a way that pure legend alone might not sustain. The Superstition Mountains do contain mineralization. The volcanic origin of the range, particularly the hydrothermal activity associated with the caldera collapse roughly 29 million years ago, created conditions that are consistent with the formation of mineral deposits, including gold. The area around Weaver's Needle has been surveyed by geologists, and the surveys do confirm the presence of gold-bearing rock, just not in concentrations that would constitute a commercially viable mine by modern standards. Small amounts, traces, the kind of presence that would have been meaningful to a 19th century prospector working by hand, but that would not justify the industrial scale operation that some versions of the legend describe. What this means, practically, is that the mine story is not geologically absurd. Someone like Jacob Waltz, prospecting in the range in the 1860s and 1870s, could have found a surface deposit or a small vein that yielded meaningful amounts of gold with the tools and methods of that era. The ore samples he reportedly showed people in Phoenix, the gold he has documented as having brought into town on various occasions, these are not impossible to account for without invoking a massive hidden mine. A modest deposit worked carefully over years could produce what the historical record actually shows. The legend of an enormous, inexhaustible motherlode may be exactly that, a legend, a story that grew in the retelling. But the kernel of it, a man who found gold somewhere in these mountains, is not implausible, and that ambiguity is load-bearing. If the geology completely ruled out the presence of gold, the search would have wound down long ago. If someone had definitively found and exhausted a deposit near the Needle, the story would have resolved. Instead, the geological record says, essentially there could be something here, just probably not as much as people hope, and in a location that has not been confirmed. That is exactly the kind of answer that keeps searchers going. Not a clear yes, not a clear no, a maybe that has been aging for over a century. The area around the Needle has been searched in extraordinary detail. Individual treasure hunters have spent years working specific drainages, specific cliff faces, specific areas of discoloured rock that might indicate mineralization. The canyon systems on the eastern and northern approaches to the Needle have been explored by people carrying metal detectors, geological survey equipment, and in some cases ground-penetrating radar. Some of these people have been serious, methodical, and technically capable. Some have published their findings or their theories in the treasure hunting literature that has accumulated around the lost Dutchman legend over the decades. None of them have found the mine, or at least none of them have found it and said so publicly. There is a strain of thought within the treasure hunting community that someone may have found it and stayed quiet, which is not an entirely irrational position, given that announcing the discovery of a gold mine on federal land would create a complex legal situation. The superstitions are part of the Tonto National Forest, and mining claims on national forest land involve a specific regulatory process that is not simple. Whether anyone has actually found something and remained silent is, of course, impossible to know from the outside. It is the kind of claim that circulates endlessly in communities organised around secrets, and it functions more as narrative than as evidence. What is documented is that the search continues. There are people planning trips to the Needle right now, working from maps they have spent months developing, cross-referencing Waltz's supposed descriptions with topographic surveys. looking for a canyon that faces a certain direction, a rock formation that matches a particular description, a drainage that would have been a logical place to work a small mine in the 1870s. Some of these people are careful and experienced, and will return home safely with nothing found. Some of them will push further than they should, stay later than is wise, carry less water than the terrain requires, and find themselves in the situation that the SAR teams know too well. The saddle at Fremont is, in this sense, a threshold. Not a supernatural one, nothing like that, but a practical one. It is the point at which the maintained trail ends and the real terrain begins. It is the point at which the view of the needle creates its deceptive sense of closeness. And it is the point at which a certain kind of decision gets made, the decision to go further, to get closer, to see if what you can see from here looks different from a quarter-mile nearer, to find the drainage that matches the description, to not turn back yet. Rangers have noted that a disproportionate number of serious incidents in the Superstitions involve people who were last seen at or near Fremont Saddle, or who made the decision to leave the Peralta Trail at that point and head toward the needle across open terrain. The needle itself is not the destination in most of these cases. It is the orientation point, the landmark that organises the search space. Waltz's descriptions, as they have been interpreted and reinterpreted over generations, place the mine somewhere within view of a prominent formation, and the area within view of Weaver's Needle is vast. It includes multiple canyon systems, several miles of ridgeline, numerous drainages, and terrain that changes character significantly depending on which approach you take. The search space that the needle defines is not a small target. It is a large, complex, dangerous piece of ground that has been absorbing human attention and in some cases human lives for a very long time. There is something quietly remarkable about that, if you step back from the specifics for a moment. A volcanic plug, the solidified remnant of a geological event that happened tens of millions of years ago, has become the organising centre of a human story that has been running for over a century. The needle did not ask for this role. It does not know it has one. It is rock, old and indifferent, standing in the desert light the way it has stood through all the centuries of searching and dying and hoping that have happened in its shadow. But the human meaning that has accumulated around it is real, and the consequences of that meaning are real, and the people who have been lost in the terrain that surrounds it were real people with names and families and reasons for being there. The ambiguity that the geology provides, the genuine if modest presence of gold in the region, the plausibility of a small historical deposit, the impossibility of proving a complete negative across terrain this complex, is part of what makes the story of the needle so persistent. It is not entirely myth. It is not entirely fact. It lives in the space between them, and that space has proven to be one of the most dangerous places in the American Southwest. Not because of what might be hidden in it, but because of what people are willing to do in pursuit of something they cannot quite rule out. The cluster of disappearances that drew national attention in the years around 2009 to 2012 made this dynamic visible in a way that was hard to ignore, and it is worth looking at those cases in some detail. Jesse Capon was 35 years old and lived in Denver, Colorado. By most accounts, he was not a casual visitor to the Superstitions. He had been there before. He had studied the lost Dutchman legend with the kind of sustained attention that goes beyond casual interest, reading the literature, working through the competing theories, building his own interpretation of where the mine might be. He was, in the language of the treasure hunting community, a serious searcher. He went into the mountains in December of 2009, which is actually one of the more reasonable times of year to be there. Temperatures are cooler, the brutal summer heat is gone, the monsoon season is long finished. He went alone. He did not come back. The initial search found nothing. The terrain around the area where he was believed to have gone offered no clear answers. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The case stayed open but went cold in the way that missing persons cases in remote wilderness tend to go cold. Not closed, not resolved, just suspended in a kind of uncertain quiet while the mountains kept their information to themselves. He was found in November of 2012, that is nearly 3 years after he disappeared. A search team located his remains wedged inside a narrow crevice in the rock, roughly 200 feet from a trail. 200 feet. That is not a remote, inaccessible location by any normal measure. It is close enough that you could stand on the trail and, under the right conditions, possibly shout and be heard. Yet the terrain had hidden him completely for 3 years, through multiple organised searches of the same ground. The crevice was narrow enough that from above, or from any angle that a searcher moving along the trail would naturally use, it was essentially invisible unless you were standing directly over it and looking down at exactly the right angle. His body showed no signs of foul play. The working conclusion was that he fell into the crevice, became trapped, and could not get out. There is something about that detail, 200 feet from a trail, 3 years undiscovered, that captures something essential about the superstitions. The place does not have to be vast to be concealing. The volcanic tuff that makes up the range is fractured and complex at a small scale, full of cracks, overhangs and narrow passages that do not read as significant from a distance, but become absolute barriers up close. A person can vanish into the terrain not because the terrain is enormous, but because it is intricate in ways that are hard to appreciate until you are inside it. Curtis Merworth disappeared in May of 2010, about 5 months after Cappan. He was also searching for the mine. He went into the mountains and did not return. Unlike Cappan, he has never been found. Extensive searches were conducted, and the searchers found nothing. No remains, no gear, no indication of where he went after entering the range. He was 54 years old. May in the superstitions means heat that is already climbing toward its summer peak. Temperatures in the lower canyons that can push well past 100 degrees by midday. The combination of that heat, the terrain, and the isolation of a solo hiker creates a situation where the margin for error is extremely thin. One wrong turn, one ankle rolled on loose tuff, one water source that turns out to be dry, and a person can be in serious trouble within hours. The fact that Merworth has never been found is not in itself evidence of anything unusual. The terrain is more than capable of concealing a person indefinitely, as the Cappan case demonstrated. But the absence of any trace at all, after organised searches with trained personnel, is the kind of outcome that stays with the people who conducted those searches. Ardean Charles was 52 years old. Malcolm Meeks was 41. They disappeared together in October of 2010, which put them in the mountains during the tail end of monsoon season, a period when the weather can shift quickly and drainages that appear dry can fill with fast-moving water with very little warning. Their bodies were found, but the circumstances of their deaths pointed toward exposure and the effects of the terrain and weather rather than any single dramatic event. The likely involvement of flash flooding has been noted in accounts of their case. October flash floods in the superstitions are not rare. The monsoon season officially runs through September, but late storms can push water through the canyon systems well into autumn. A narrow drainage that looks like a dry walkable channel in the morning can become a moving wall of water and debris within minutes of a storm hitting the higher elevations, even if the sky above the canyon floor appears clear. People who have not experienced this phenomenon tend to underestimate it significantly. The sound arrives before the water does, but not by much, and in a narrow canyon with walls that do not offer easy escape routes, the options narrow very quickly. The concentration of these cases in a relatively short window drew attention in a way that individual disappearances over the preceding decades had not quite managed. By 2011 and into 2012, the national media had picked up the story. The superstitions were being written about and discussed not just in the treasure hunting community, but in mainstream news outlets, which brought a different kind of scrutiny to the range and to the question of why people kept dying and disappearing there. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, which handles search and rescue operations in the range, was fairly direct in its assessment. When officials spoke to reporters during this period, they described a consistent pattern across the recent cases and across the longer history of incidents in the mountains. Many of the victims were found or were believed to have gone in with inadequate water. Not slightly inadequate, seriously inadequate for the conditions and the terrain. People were entering the range with a single water bottle for a full day's hiking in temperatures that demand several litres of water to survive safely. Some had no map. Some had no communication device of any kind, not even a basic cell phone, which would have limited range in the canyons anyway but would have been better than nothing. Some had not told anyone where they were going or when they expected to return, which meant that when they did not come back, the alarm was not raised immediately. These are not mysterious failures. They are the kinds of preparation failures that wilderness safety educators have been warning against for decades. But they keep happening, and they keep happening specifically in the superstitions with a frequency that is disproportionate to the range's size. The mountains cover roughly 160,000 acres, which is not small, but it is not enormous by Western wilderness standards. There are wilderness areas in the American West that are 10 times larger and do not generate anywhere near the same volume of serious incidents per year. The concentration of problems in the superstitions is not simply a function of how much land there is. Part of the explanation, almost certainly, is the treasure hunting culture. People who go into the superstitions looking for the lost Dutchman mine are not always approaching the trip as a wilderness hike that requires standard safety preparation. They are approaching it as a mission with a specific objective, and that framing changes behaviour in subtle but important ways. A person who is focused on finding a mine, who believes they may be close, who has been planning this particular trip for months, is not in the same mental state as a person who is simply out for a day hike and is happy to turn back when conditions suggest it. The goal-oriented mindset that treasure hunting encourages can suppress the ordinary caution that keeps people safe. You push a little further because you think the next drainage is the one. You stay a little longer because the light is still good, and you want to check one more rock formation. You drink your water faster than you planned because the terrain is harder than expected, and you tell yourself you will find more at the next spring, which turns out to be dry. The response from land management authorities after the 2009 to 2012 cluster was practical and measured. The Tonto National Forest increased signage on the main trails, adding more explicit warnings about heat, water requirements, and the dangers of leaving marked trails. Emergency water caches were established at certain trailheads, providing a last resort supply for people in serious trouble close to the trailhead. Public safety campaigns were run in coordination with the media coverage, using the attention the disappearances had generated to push basic safety information to a wider audience. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office increased its public communications about SAR operations in the range, partly to raise awareness, and partly, one suspects, to make clear to potential visitors that rescue was not guaranteed and that the terrain was genuinely dangerous regardless of how close to Phoenix it appeared on a map. These were reasonable responses, and some of them probably helped. The water caches in particular represent the kind of practical intervention that can save a life in a specific scenario. The person who made it back to the trailhead but was severely dehydrated and could not safely drive or walk further. The signage and public safety campaigns reached some people who might otherwise have gone in underprepared. Rangers describe conversations at trailheads where they have talked people out of going in with one water bottle at noon in July, and some of those conversations probably prevented incidents that would otherwise have become statistics. But the disappearances did not stop. The years after 2012 continued to produce incidents, some fatal, some resulting in rescues, some resulting in people being found disoriented and dehydrated but alive. The pattern that the 2009 to 2012 cluster made visible was not a temporary anomaly. It was a snapshot of something ongoing, a dynamic that the mountains and the people who are drawn to them have been generating for a very long time and show no particular sign of stopping. What the cluster also revealed, or perhaps confirmed for people who had been paying attention, was the specific role that the Lost Dutchman legend plays as a risk multiplier. Remove the legend entirely. Imagine the superstitions as a range with no treasure story attached to it, just a geological formation east of Phoenix with challenging terrain and dangerous summer heat. and you would still have a place where unprepared hikers got into trouble. The terrain and the climate are dangerous on their own terms. But the particular character of the disappearances, the solo hikers pushing into difficult terrain beyond marked trails, the people returning multiple times, the cases where victims were found with research notes and maps, the cases where victims were last seen heading toward Weaver's Needle, these details point to something beyond ordinary recreational risk. The legend is not a metaphor here, it is a mechanism. It changes the specific decisions that specific people make in specific moments, and some of those decisions are the decisions that kill them. There is a version of this story that stops here and draws a clean conclusion. The mountains are dangerous. The legend makes them more dangerous. People should be more careful. That is true as far as it goes. But it does not quite capture the full texture of what the superstitions are, which includes not just the danger, but the extraordinary persistence of human attention that the place generates. People know about the deaths. The deaths are documented, reported, discussed in the very communities that are planning the next search, and people keep going. The treasure hunting forums that were active before the 2009 to 2012 cluster were still active afterward. The annual events in Apache Junction continued. The trails continued to fill with visitors, some of them careful and experienced, some of them not, and some of them carrying maps they had spent months developing, and a conviction that this time, finally, they had figured out what all the previous searchers had missed. That persistence is not stupidity, or at least it is not only stupidity. It is something more complicated, a combination of genuine historical ambiguity, the psychological pull of a landscape with this much accumulated meaning, and the very human difficulty of accepting that something you have invested deeply in might simply not be there. The mountains have been absorbing that investment for generations, and they have not given back much in return. What they have given back mostly is more questions, and the questions are part of what keeps drawing people toward them, even now, even with the record of what has happened written clearly enough for anyone to read. Which brings us, in a way, to what the superstitions actually are today. Not just a place where people have died or disappeared, not just a landscape organised around an old legend, but a functioning, visited, managed, and in some ways thoroughly modern destination that somehow manages to remain genuinely dangerous despite everything that has been built up around it. The Superstition Mountains today are on paper a success story of outdoor recreation management. More than 200,000 people visit the range each year, arriving through the town of Apache Junction, which sits at the western edge of the mountains and has built a substantial portion of its identity around the legend that surrounds them. Lost Dutchman State Park occupies a stretch of the lower slopes just northeast of Apache Junction, offering developed campgrounds, picnic areas, interpretive signs, and trailhead access to some of the most popular routes in the range. It is a well-maintained park with flush toilets and a visitor centre and a parking lot that fills up on weekend mornings from October through April. On a cool February morning, standing in that parking lot, looking east toward the jagged ridgeline with the Flatiron Formation visible above and Weaver's Needle somewhere deeper in, it is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind the full weight of what has happened in the terrain beyond. The Superstition Mountain Museum, also in Apache Junction, houses a collection of artifacts, maps, and exhibits related to the Lost Dutchman legend and the broader history of the range. There is a full-scale reproduction of an old mining camp. There are display cases with ore samples and historical photographs. There are exhibits on Jacob Waltz, on the Peralta legend, on the various searchers who came before and after. It is the kind of local museum that takes its subject seriously and presents it with genuine care, and if you spend an hour there before heading into the mountains, you leave with a reasonable understanding of why this place matters to the people who live near it and love it. The annual Lost Dutchman Days Festival, held each February in Apache Junction, draws visitors from across the country for events that include a parade, a treasure hunt, live music, and various competitions. It has been running for decades. It is cheerful and well-attended and deeply fond of the legend it celebrates, and it is held with a certain gentle irony at precisely the time of year when the weather is most forgiving and the mountains are at their most inviting. All of this is real and functioning and represents a genuine community relationship with the range. Apache Junction grew up alongside the Superstitions, and the mountains are woven into the local economy and the local identity in ways that go well beyond tourism brochures. People who have lived there for generations have a different relationship with the range than the visitors who arrive with research notes and treasure maps. They know the mountains as a place you hike on weekends, a landmark you navigate by, a backdrop to ordinary life. The danger is not abstract to them, but neither is it the whole story. And yet, alongside all of this infrastructure and familiarity, the warnings remain serious and specific. Rangers at the Tonto National Forest describe a pattern that repeats itself with enough regularity to have become almost predictable. Visitors arrive at the Peralta Trailhead, or the First Water Trailhead, often in the morning, often in groups, often wearing reasonable gear. They read the signs, they take a photograph of the trail map, and then, somewhere in the first mile or two, the terrain begins to engage them in a way that subtly shifts their judgment about how far they can reasonably go. The Peralta Trail is genuinely beautiful. The canyon it follows opens up dramatically, the saguaros giving way to exposed volcanic ridgelines, the light doing remarkable things to the orange and rust-coloured rock. Fremont Saddle at the end of the main trail is only about 2.5 miles from the trailhead, and the view of Weaver's Needle from there is one of the more striking things you can see in the American Southwest. For a prepared hiker on a mild day, it is a manageable and rewarding trip, but the trail gains about 1,300 feet in those 2.5 miles, and the return trip is in full sun for much of its length, and the people who get into trouble are often the ones who decided at Fremont Saddle that the needle looked close enough to reach. It does not look close enough to reach because it is close. It looks close enough because the visual clarity of the desert air and the dramatic scale of the rock formations conspire to make distances feel compressed. What appears to be a 40-minute scramble from the saddle can become a 3-hour ordeal in terrain that is not maintained, not marked, and not forgiving of mistakes. Rangers describe rescues that began at Fremont Saddle, where someone looked at the needle and made a decision that seemed reasonable at 10 in the morning and became a crisis by 2 in the afternoon. The Dutchman's Trail, which runs deeper into the range and connects to a network of backcountry routes, is one of the most hiked trails in the entire Tonto National Forest. It is named after Jacob Waltz, which tells you something about the cultural weight that the legend carries even in the official infrastructure of the place. The trail is long, around 17 miles for the full route, and it passes through terrain that becomes progressively more demanding and more remote as it moves away from the trailheads. Day hikers who underestimate its length or overestimate their pace are a recurring source of SAR calls. The trail passes near several of the locations that treasure hunting law has identified as significant, and on any given weekend in the cooler months, you will encounter people who are hiking it for the exercise, and people who are hiking it with a different kind of purpose, moving more slowly, stopping to examine rock formations, consulting something on their phone or in a notebook. Those second category hikers are not a monolith. Some of them are casual enthusiasts who enjoy the historical dimension of the area without any serious expectation of finding anything. Some of them are deeply committed researchers who have spent years developing theories about the mine's location and are testing specific hypotheses in specific terrain. A small number of them are somewhere in between, people who started casually and found themselves drawn progressively deeper into the research, spending more time, more money, more energy on a question that keeps producing new angles without producing an answer. The online communities dedicated to the Lost Dutchman search are active and detailed, and sometimes contentious, with competing theories and disputed interpretations of historical documents and fierce disagreements about the meaning of particular rock formations. They are not for the most part credulous or careless people. Many of them have done serious research and know the historical record well. The problem is not that they are uninformed. The problem is that the question they are trying to answer may not have an answer that the terrain will yield, and the effort of trying to find it can lead people into situations the terrain does not forgive. Modern searchers have access to tools that Jacob Waltz and the early treasure hunters could not have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar has been used in the range. Drone surveys have mapped sections of terrain that were previously accessible only on foot. Geological survey data is publicly available and has been analysed by people with actual training in mineralogy and economic geology. Some searchers have collaborated with professional geologists who have confirmed what the basic geology of the range already suggests, that there is gold in the Superstitions. Not in the concentrated, easily extractable deposits that the legend implies, but in the diffuse, low-grade deposits that are typical of the volcanic tuff formation. This is not nothing, but it is also not the mother lode. It is the kind of geological reality that a determined believer can interpret as confirmation that the richer deposit must be somewhere nearby, just not yet found, and that a skeptic can interpret as the complete explanation for every gold sample Jacob Waltz ever showed anyone. The coexistence of all of this, the developed park infrastructure and the backcountry danger, the casual day hikers and the obsessive long-term searchers, the modern geological analysis and the persistent legend, the annual festival and the ongoing SAR operations, is one of the genuinely strange things about the Superstitions as they exist today. Most places that are dangerous are legible as dangerous. They look remote, or they lack infrastructure, or they carry clear warnings that most people take seriously. The Superstitions are 40 miles from one of the largest cities in the United States. They have a state park and a museum and a festival. They have well-marked trailheads and interpretive signs and emergency water caches, and people still die in them, still disappear in them, in ways that are not always fully explained even after extensive investigation. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office conducts dozens of rescues in the range each year. In particularly active years, the Superstitions account for a striking share of Arizona's total backcountry SAR operations relative to their size. The rescues range from minor, people who twisted an ankle or ran out of water close to the trailhead, to major, multi-day operations involving ground teams and helicopters searching terrain that resists systematic coverage. The SAR volunteers and rangers who work the range describe it with a particular kind of respect that is different from the respect you hear about other dangerous wilderness areas. Other dangerous places are dangerous because they are vast, or because the weather is extreme, or because the access is genuinely difficult. The Superstitions are dangerous partly for those reasons, but also for a reason that is harder to articulate, something about the way the terrain and the mythology and the psychological state of the people who come here interact to produce outcomes that the terrain alone would not necessarily produce. A ranger who has worked the range for many years, speaking to a journalist during the coverage of the 2009 to 2012 disappearances, put it in plain terms. He said that the mountains were not unusually large or unusually remote, but that they had an unusual ability to make people do things they would not otherwise do. Go farther than they planned, stay later than they should, leave the trail for terrain they were not equipped for. He was not suggesting anything supernatural. He was describing a pattern he had observed repeatedly, a pattern in which the specific combination of the landscape's visual character, its historical associations, and the psychological state of people who had been thinking about it for months or years produced a consistent and dangerous outcome. That observation is worth sitting with for a moment, because it points to something that is easy to miss when you're looking at the Superstitions primarily as a geological formation or a historical mystery. The mountains are not just a place, they are an idea that people carry with them when they enter the terrain, and that idea shapes what they see, what they decide, and how far they go. The idea is old and layered and has been reinforced by 150 years of stories, and it is, in a very practical sense, one of the things that makes the mountains dangerous. Not the only thing, not even the primary thing, but a real thing, with documented consequences. The searches for the mine continue. They are happening now in the sense that there are people who are currently planning trips currently developing theories, currently marking waypoints on maps and cross-referencing them with historical accounts. Some of them are careful and experienced, and will go in well prepared, and come back with nothing but sore feet and more questions. Some of them will get into trouble and be rescued. Some of them, in the statistical reality of what the superstitions have been producing for well over a century, will not come back at all. The mountains do not distinguish between these categories in advance. They receive everyone who enters them with the same indifference, the same fractured volcanic ridgelines, the same dry drainages, the same light that shifts the apparent distance of everything it touches. What is perhaps most striking about the superstitions as they exist today is not the danger or the legend or the tourism infrastructure, but the way all of these things occupy the same space without resolving into a single coherent story. The state park and the disappearances, the festival and the SAR calls, the museum exhibit on Jacob Waltz, and the crevice where Jesse Kappen was found 3 years after he went missing. These things are all true simultaneously, and the mountains hold them all without apparent contradiction, because the mountains are not organising themselves around a human narrative. They are simply there, east of Phoenix, doing what they have always done, which is to be exactly as dangerous as their geology and their climate make them, and to mean exactly as much as the people who look at them decide they mean. That gap between what the mountains are and what people believe them to be is where most of the story lives. And it is a gap that has not closed in the 150 years since Anglo settlers gave this range its name. If anything, it may have deepened as the legend accumulated more layers and the search communities grew more organised, and the documented record of what happens here became longer and more specific. The mountains are better known now than they have ever been, and they remain, in some essential way, as opaque as they always were, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about them, and also the thing that makes it hardest to simply look at them from the valley and decide to leave them alone. There is something in the way they look from a distance, the jagged silhouette against a pale desert sky, the needle just visible above the ridgeline on a clear day, that invites a kind of attention that does not easily let go. It has been inviting that attention for a very long time. And the question of what that attention costs and whether anything it has ever found was worth the price is the question that the closing of this story asks us to sit with. And so we arrive at the question that has been sitting quietly underneath everything else in this story. Not the question of where the mine is, or whether Jacob Waltz ever found gold, or what happened to the people who went in and did not come out. Those are the surface questions, the ones the legend offers up front. The deeper question is something more like this. What does it mean that a place like this exists, and that people keep being drawn to it, and that the drawing and the danger and the mythology have been feeding each other for well over a century without any of it resolving? The Superstition Mountains are not the most dangerous wilderness in the American West. That is worth saying plainly. There are mountain ranges with higher elevations, more extreme weather, longer approaches, and fewer rescue resources. There are desert regions, more remote and more unforgiving. If you ranked American wilderness areas purely by the difficulty of their terrain, the superstitions would not be at the top. They cover roughly 160,000 acres. They sit 40 miles from a major American city. There are well-marked trails, trailhead facilities, emergency water caches, and a search and rescue operation that responds quickly. By the numbers, they should not be producing the kind of a record they have, but they are. And the reason they are is not reducible to any single factor. The geology is real. Fractured volcanic tuff, narrow drainages, ridge lines that look identical from multiple angles, summer temperatures that exceed 110 degrees in the lower canyons, flash floods that arrive without warning through passages that seem perfectly dry. These things kill people. They have killed people. They will kill more people. If there were no legend, no lost Dutchman, no Peralta story, no thunder god, no treasure-hunting community, the mountains would still claim a certain number of visitors every year, simply because they are what they are physically. But the legend is also real. in the sense that it is real in its effects. It draws people who would not otherwise come. It draws them back when they should stop. It makes them go farther than the terrain justifies, stay later than the light allows, leave the trail for ground they are not equipped to handle. It creates a particular kind of motivated reasoning, the kind where every ambiguous rock formation becomes a landmark, every unexplained sound becomes a signal, every near miss becomes confirmation that you are getting close. The legend does not cause flash floods or heat stroke, but it puts specific kinds of people in specific kinds of situations where flash floods and heat stroke can reach them. That is not a supernatural claim. It is a behavioural one, and it is supported by the record. Jesse Cappan was 35 years old when he disappeared in December 2009. He had made multiple trips to the Superstitions before the one he did not return from. He was not reckless in any obvious way. He was thoughtful and organised, by the accounts of people who knew him, and he was genuinely convinced he had identified something the other searchers had missed. He went in with purpose and intention, and he was found 3 years later wedged in a narrow crevice, roughly 200 feet from a trail. The crevice was not far from where people had walked during the search. The terrain had simply swallowed him in a way that resisted discovery, and he had been close to ordinary ground the entire time. That detail is hard to sit with, not because it is supernatural, but because it is the opposite. It is entirely physical, entirely explainable, and entirely devastating in its plainness. Curtis Merworth has never been found. He disappeared in May 2010, during a period when the mountains were already receiving national attention because of the other disappearances that year. Extensive searches covered the relevant terrain. Nothing was recovered. He is still listed as missing. The mountains are not large enough that a person should simply vanish without a trace in them, and yet that is what has happened, more than once, across more than a century of documented cases. The terrain offers enough fractures, enough crevices, enough drainages choked with brush, enough places where a person could come to rest in a way that would not be visible from any angle a search team could practically cover. The Apache knew something about this place before any of the legends were layered onto it. Their relationship with the range was not one of simple avoidance. It was more nuanced than that, more specific. The mountains were treated as a place that required a particular kind of attention and a particular kind of respect. The protocols around entering them were not arbitrary. They reflected generations of practical knowledge about what the terrain could do to a person who was not careful, combined with a spiritual framework that gave that knowledge a form people could carry and transmit. When Anglo settlers arrived in the mid-1800s and applied the name superstition to the range, they were recording something real, even if they framed it in terms that reduced the Apache understanding to mere superstition. The warning was genuine. The content of the warning was practical, and the people who ignored it, who went in with the specific confidence of those who believed they had found something the previous searchers had missed, paid for that confidence at a rate that has been consistent across 150 years. There is something almost geometric about the way the superstitions work on people. The legend is specific enough to be compelling, but vague enough that it can never be definitively disproven. The mine has not been found, but the mine has also not been proven not to exist. The gold that Jacob Waltz showed people in Phoenix was real, or at least some accounts suggest it was, but its source was never confirmed. The Peralta stones were almost certainly a hoax, but the idea that Spanish or Mexican miners worked the range before American settlement is not geologically absurd, because there is actual mineral wealth in the area, just not in the concentrations the legend implies. Every layer of the story has just enough ambiguity at its edges to keep the next searcher convinced that the previous ones simply did not look in the right place. And the mountains themselves cooperate with this dynamic, not intentionally, not through any agency, but through their nature. They look different in different light. The same ridgeline can appear to be in two different locations depending on where you're standing and what time of day it is. Weaver's Needle, visible from much of the range, shifts in apparent position as you move through the terrain. Landmarks that seem clear from a distance dissolve into confusion when you are among them. The compass readings that are sometimes unreliable near magnetite deposits add another layer of uncertainty. The place is genuinely disorienting in ways that go beyond the ordinary difficulty of backcountry navigation, and that disorientation is not imagined. It is documented by experienced hikers who went in with good equipment and found themselves uncertain in ways they did not expect. What the mountains are, then, is a place where physical danger and psychological vulnerability and cultural mythology have been reinforcing each other for long enough that they have become almost inseparable. The danger feeds the mythology because people die and disappear, and the causes are sometimes unclear. The mythology feeds the danger because it draws people who are already in a particular psychological state, one that compromises their judgment in specific and predictable ways. The two things have been circling each other since the 1840s, and there is no obvious mechanism by which that cycle would stop. The people who know the mountains best, the rangers, the SAR volunteers, the long-time hikers who have spent decades in the range, tend to speak about it with a particular kind of care. They do not dismiss the legend, not because they believe it, but because they understand that the legend is part of the landscape in a functional sense. It is one of the things the terrain does to people, one of the forces acting on anyone who enters the range with a map and a theory. You cannot separate the superstitions from the story of the lost Dutchman any more than you can separate them from the volcanic geology. Both are part of what makes the place what it is. The mountains are still there right now east of Phoenix, looking exactly as they have always looked. On a clear morning you can see them from the highway, the jagged ridgeline rising against the sky, Weaver's Needle just visible above the profile of the range. They look theatrical from a distance, almost too dramatic, like a set built for a film about the American Southwest. They look like they are waiting for something. They are not, of course. They are not waiting for anything. They are simply there, doing what geological formations do, which is nothing at all, in a way that happens to be exactly as dangerous as the physics of their terrain makes them. But people are planning trips into them right now. Somewhere tonight someone has a map open on a table and a set of notes cross-referenced with historical accounts, and a theory about a drainage that has not been properly searched. Someone is checking the weather forecast for the weekend and deciding that conditions look good. Someone is packing a bag and telling themselves they will be careful, they will be back before dark, they will not make the mistakes the others made. Some of those people will be right. They will go in, walk through terrain that is genuinely beautiful in a spare and severe way. Feel the specific quality of light that the volcanic rock produces in late afternoon, and come back out with sore feet and a clearer sense of why people keep coming here. Some of them will get into trouble and be found. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office will respond, the SAR teams will go in, and someone will be carried or walked out of the range and taken to a hospital, and eventually recover, and probably, in a certain percentage of cases, start planning their next trip. And some of them, in the statistical reality that the superstitions have been producing with quiet consistency for well over a century, will not come back. The range will receive them the way it has received everyone who entered it, without returning, without ceremony, without explanation, and without any apparent awareness that anything has happened at all. The mountains will not explain themselves. They never have. The legend does not explain them. The geology explains some of what happens there, and the psychology explains more, and the combination of the two explains most of it. But there is a remainder, small and stubborn, that resists the complete accounting. Not because something supernatural is operating in the superstitions, more likely because the terrain is genuinely complex, human behaviour under stress is genuinely unpredictable, and the record is incomplete in ways that may never be fully resolved. What the superstitions leave you with, if you spend enough time with their history, is not a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter and more durable than that. It is the recognition that a place can be ordinary in its geology and extraordinary in its effect on people. That danger does not require the supernatural to be real and persistent and hard to account for, and that the stories we tell about the places we fear are not separate from those places. They are part of them. They shape what happens there. They have consequences. The jagged ridgeline is still visible from the highway tonight. The needle is still there above the saddle. The canyons are dark and dry and quiet, or they are running with water if the monsoon has come, and they do not look dangerous from a distance. They rarely do. That is part of it. Sleep well wherever you are tonight, and if you ever find yourself standing at the Peralta trailhead at first light, looking up at the ridgeline with a full water bottle and a careful plan, pay attention to the terrain more than the legend. The mountains are worth seeing. They are genuinely worth the walk. Just remember that they have been receiving people who are certain they had found something the others missed for a very long time, and they are patient in a way that people are not. If this story has been good company tonight, a like or a subscription to Life Beyond Seen means a great deal. There are more quiet places to explore, more histories to sit with, more questions worth asking slowly in the dark. We will be here when you are ready.